It is almost literally impossible in the world of Westeros to think of the Kingsguard without thinking of Ser Ryam Redwyne. Bran, who dreams about joining the White Cloak someday, names Ryam Redwyne along with not just other historical great knights, but also legendary heroes of Westerosi myth. Nearly every time outstanding alumni of the Kingsguard are named, Ryam Redwyne is one of the knights cited. He's openly referred to as the greatest knight of his day, the subject of songs, a paragon of chivalry that every other knight or would-be knight of Westeros should try to live up to. So what do we know about Ryam Redwyne? Can we separate fact from fiction and truth from legend when it comes to one of the most celebrated knights in Kingsguard of all time? It's hard not to exaggerate, right? What was it that made Ryam so famous, not just in his own time, but 2 centuries after his death in current times? And does Ryam actually deserve this golden reputation that he's enjoyed in Westerosi memory? What impact has Ryam Redwyne had on the knights who came after him? And has that always been a positive legacy? All that and more, including our favorite and best contributor as returning guest on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody. This is a pre-recorded episode of History of Westeros podcast. You can still catch every video on YouTube or Spotify, and the audio is available anywhere you catch podcasts, and it's ad-free if you listen on Patreon. Hey, we have Nina Krusling back. She is the main writer of this episode, and you can find her, as always, at Good Queen Alley with 1L at tumblr.com. How's it going, Nina?
It's going good. Well, I was very flattered when you said that I was your favorite contributor, but I have to amend that to say favorite regular guest and contributor, because you have literally interviewed George R. R. Martin.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I feel like I can't really compete
good
there.
Point. All right.
But I'm doing very well. I'm very excited to talk about Ryam Redwyne.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we are too. If you have questions about this episode, you can always hit us up at westroshistory@gmail.com or any of the socials we're on, and we're on all of them. As usual, I would like to start with the section headers, the name of each part we're going to talk about, and then we'll get right to it. We have our setup and our first mention, and as we often do with characters, we'll go early life, and then for him, knighthood, Kingsguard, as a new brother, a lusty brother, later troubles, Lord Commander, Hand of the King, Unhand of the King, last year's Last of the Redwyne, legacy, and then outro and hot D. So let's do it. Here is a famous quote from Bran to A Game of Thrones.
Bran was going to be a knight himself someday, one of the Kingsguard. Old Nan said they were the finest swords in all the realm. There were only 7 of them, and they wore white armor and had no wives or children, but lived only to serve the king. Bran knew all the stories. Their names were like music to him. Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, Ser Ryam Redwyne, Prince Aemon the Dragonknight, the twins Ser Eric and Ser Arik, who had died on one another's swords hundreds of years ago when brother fought sister in the war the singers called the Dance of the Dragons, the White Bull Gerald Hightower, Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, Barristan the Bold.
As we said in the intro, he's mentioned early and for a historical figure often, mentioned alongside heroes as well as legends and myths. So it's really exclusive company. He first appears, as far as first appearances go, in Fire and Blood. His mention there in A Time of Testing, A Realm Remade, which is the beginning of Jaehaerys and Alysanne's reign. It's when Ryam and his brothers go to court as squires. So they go to the Red Keep at a pretty early age, and that sets the stage for his early life. We don't know exactly when he was born, but we can make some educated guesses. Nina, what do you think?
Well, I think that we can narrow it down to a fairly identifiable window and then sort of pick an age that makes sense to you within that. Really, all we have to go on in terms of hard fact is that he's knighted by 58 AC, because this is when he's competing in the anniversary tourney. So he's probably not much younger than his late teens at this point. He may be in his early 20s. We can also look to the fact that at this tourney, or when he's at this tourney, I should say, Gildain refers to him as a quote-unquote young gallant. We don't really hear that phrase anywhere else in Song of Ice and Fire. I think the only other time it gets mentioned is Arianne teasing Eris Oakhart and calling him her young gallant. But again, that's in the context of teasing, so I don't know how much we can really take from that. But he does use young and gallant together sometimes. He uses it with Ned, who refers to the 20-something Edmure as being young and gallant. He uses it later in Fire and Blood to refer to Criston Cole when he's Rhaenyra's sworn shield as being young and gallant when he's in his 20s. So I think it's probably fair to say that Ryam was somewhere in the neighborhood of late teens to early to mid-20s in 58 AC. So probably born somewhere in the late 30s or maybe very early 40s AC.
So he was the third son of Lord Manfred Redwyne, who, of course, Lord of the Arbor. This is a house that's second tier prominent in A Song of Ice and Fire, give or take. They're very rich and powerful. They have one of the largest navies in Westeros, and that's been the case off and on for several centuries at the minimum. So let's talk about the Redwynes in this era.
And you hit the nail on the head here. The Redwynes are an extremely prominent aristocratic house, not just in the context of the Reach, although that's absolutely true as well, but in the greater context of Westeros. This is one of the oldest and proudest and richest and most powerful families in the entire realm. And I should note, it's a little bit amusing in this generation because Manfred and his wife clearly like our names because they go with Robert, Rickard, and Ryam for their three sons.
They've got
the
a
last
type.
name is Redwyne. But no, they are an incredibly important aristocratic family. And so I think we can say that young Ryam is being born with the proverbial silver spoon in his mouth. At the same time, though, we might call him sort of a Ryam Lackland because he's not the heir and he's not the spare. He's not eldest brother Robert, who's going to inherit the Arbor. He's not even middle brother Rickard, who, 7 forbid, anything happens to Robert, is going to inherit and is probably, in any event, going to be his brother's right-hand man. There's really not a immediately identifiable career for Ryam, so to speak. So it's left a bit open in terms of what Ryam's future will be, despite the fact that he's got this extremely high aristocratic privilege and status.
Later in the episode, we'll discuss his legacy in full because it's a big one, but we'll go through his life before that. He's cited often in the books as an inspiration, and as we said, he's made legendary by how often he's placed amongst the best of all time. So we could ask who his major influences have been, whose legacy had a big impact on him. Now, to put that in context, the Kingsguard hadn't been around nearly as long. Obviously, chivalry in the Reach is ancient, but the Kingsguard, when he was knighted, was only 58 years old. So by the time he's in the Kingsguard, it was only a matter of decades. Similarly, whoever these influences of his would have been, it would have been before the conquest, probably, because a lot of the other ones got cooked at the field of fire. Maybe there's not as many heroes to emulate in that sense, but it's like you said, it's fair to say he's the opposite of hedge knight archetype here. A saddle and lance were available the moment he was capable of using them, and as you said, the proverbial silver spoon, all the wealth, every advantage. But he also seemed to have all the talent, right? So,
no, absolutely. And I think that it's so important, as you mentioned, chivalry is ancient in the Reach. And it is a region that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say reveres chivalry, or at least the idea of chivalry. It's literally baked into their mythology. The Reach tells the story of John the Oak, this son of Garth Greenhand, who is supposedly the first knight in Westeros, who creates the first tourney. And at this first tourney, who's the prize but John's sister or half-sister, Maris the Maid? So this is a region where the idea of chivalry is coming from its earliest foundational myths, although obviously knighthood didn't come to Westeros itself until much later. And even though the Redwynes don't actually claim descent from John the Oak specifically, that's not their sort of heroic ancestor, Gilbert of the Vines is, this is still something they're growing up with and something that Ryam would have been growing up with. This idea that in the Reach, chivalry is all important. And we see that in a very practical way in the Hedge Knight. What happens when Dunk goes to the tourney at Ashford? At first, he's literally not allowed to compete because the master of the game says, I don't believe you're a knight, and only knights are competing here. And George R. Martin points out that's very different from something like, say, the Tourney of the Hand, where we have free riders. We have members of Ned's household who are allowed to compete even though they're not anointed knights, because Robert takes that a little less seriously. But in the Reach, the forms of chivalry are very strict and very explicit. If you can't perform as a knight and you are not knighted, you are not allowed to take part in the honor and glory of being a knight.
Yeah, that scene with Dunk certainly wouldn't have happened to a Redwyne. They'd be like, "Hey, Redwynes, how's it going? We have your table waiting right over here." Yeah, and they'd be really proud, the Reachwood, that the legendary hero of this age, which, of course, at this point in our timeline, he hasn't gotten to that status yet, but he would be a talented youngster, an up-and-comer. Maybe people would be talking about him a little bit. They'd be very proud that he was one of theirs. And the Arbor being so rich and powerful, it's interesting that they have this long tradition of such, and they, being an island, would be relatively untouched by a lot of the wars directly. And that, I think, is just a little quirk that's interesting to point out about a house that spawned such an important hero.
There's a greater discussion to have there about the Tarths versus the Redwynes in terms of their devotion to chivalry and being island nations. I don't have an idea of that. I just think it's interesting to point out.
But we are perhaps selling this short, in fact, because the Redwynes had even more advantages than what we've described. In this era, they had royal connections and ambitions.
No, absolutely. I mean, we're not talking about just a family that's resting on its aristocratic credentials. We're talking about a family that, certainly for Lord Manfred, has ambition and wants to get ahead in the royal government. Because what we see at the end of Maegor's reign, the Redwynes flip. They go to Jaehaerys and they abandon Maegor. And that's, I think, crucial for their political development in this era, because Jaehaerys seems to recognize that when his uncle Daemon Valerian is promoted to Hand of the King, Jaehaerys makes Manfred his master of ships, and that's a really important development. For the 50-odd years of Targaryen government up to this point, there had never been someone, Lord Admiral or Master of Ships, who had not been a Valerian. It's so much identified as an office with the Valerians that Yandel will go on to say that in some eras, it's almost literally considered a hereditary office for the Valerians. And yet, in this era, Jaehaerys is saying, no, I'm actually trusting Manfred Redwyne with this. And that's huge because, again, the Redwynes just flipped on the last king. And they have a huge navy rivaled only by the Valerians. So if, and they obviously don't, but if they chose to, they could be a real problem for Jaehaerys. But Jaehaerys instead cleverly brings them in, and he says, no, I'm going to reward your loyalty to me by making you an integral part of my government. And he's trusting them, and that's a trust that's going to pay off again and again as Jaehaerys' reign continues.
Yeah, it's really a golden age for a family that's existing in a golden age. So really, all the factors for Ryam come together so nicely. He's got the freedom to devote himself to knighthood as neither the heir nor the spare. Usually that's not an advantage, but he turned it to as an advantage, you could say. And obviously, as we've been describing, he's just been overflowing with privilege and opportunity here. And he absolutely didn't let that slide. We get some early accounts or details of what he was doing at court early on.
Absolutely. And so Ryam and his two older brothers come to court with their father when Manfred is appointed in 50 AC. And they're all squires when they first come to court, although it seems like Robert is pretty quickly knighted because he ends up competing as a knight in a tourney that his own father suggests the king undertake. When the Dragon Pit is completed, Manfred Redwyne says, Jaehaerys, I think it would be a great idea if you staged a tourney to celebrate it. And Jaehaerys does. And this isn't just a tourney in the king's name. This is a tourney at which, directly or indirectly, and maybe consciously on the part of Manfred Redwyne, the Redwynes come off looking very good. So we've got eldest brother Robert. He does very well in the joust. He does eventually lose. Simon Dondarrion is the winner, but he does quite well. And then we've got middle brother Rickard, who actually wins the squires tourney, and Jaehaerys knights him himself. And that's a really big deal. To be knighted by the king, is huge. It's something that Rickard can take with him and trade on that sort of cachet and name for virtually the rest of his life and the rest of his career in Westeros. So this is an era in which the Redwynes are very early on getting not just a taste of knighthood and a taste of royal knighthood, but are being almost literally put center stage as the heroes of chivalry in the capital.
Yeah, so perfect for them. There's a lot of pages in Fire and Blood devoted to Jaehaerys and Alysanne's reign. So we have a lot to work with in terms of context and what was going on in the realm. So, and what court was like at the time. So given these factors, what can we estimate or imagine Ryam's life to have been like at court during this era?
Well, I think it's a good question. It's not something that gets hugely detailed, but I think there are some things that we can take away. Again, Ryam is coming to court as a squire. Now, we don't know who he might have been squiring for on the Arbor, and we don't know what his squiring life looked like at King's Landing, but I don't think it's impossible or even improbable to say that he may have been squiring for one of the Knights of the Kingsguard. After all, his father is a major governmental figure on the King's Small Council. So the idea that his son, who is himself highly aristocratic, would then be squiring for the Kingsguard, not that far off the mark. And this is not just, in any age, I think it would be a big deal for someone to squire for a Knight of the Kingsguard. But we're talking about an age that Gyldayn will describe as perhaps the most illustrious of any age of Kingsguard. Gyldayn says that never did any Targaryen possess a Kingsguard who could equal Jaehaerys' first 7. So now imagine you're a young squire like Ryam, and you are interacting with these knights on a daily basis, maybe even squiring for them. That's gotta be hugely influential in his idea of chivalry, that he's quite literally growing up and growing as a knight by being trained by men who are considered the greatest knights of their age, and arguably, according to Gyldayn, of any age of Kingsguard.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, too, because looking at what Gyldayn says, it's definitely somewhat a matter of perspective on what you think makes Kingsguard great. And the dichotomy comes down to two things from what we've been shown, which is loyalty and to the king, willingness to die for the king, and just straight up skill at arms, the two big dichotomies there. So what Gyldayn is saying, that because this was an event where it was a tournament, an actual challenge at arms to be members of the Kingsguard, which Visenya was against this method being used, by the way. So Gyldayn is basically saying, well, this is why they're the best, because they fought for it, and that's why we know. But that isn't necessarily what makes a great Kingsguard. So that's a question we have to ask about Ryam as well. Is he clearly has the martial side, but is he also really known for being super loyal, being devoted in that sense? That's less clear, I guess, but what do you think?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and it goes to perhaps what is Ryam's take on what makes a good Kingsguard? What is he developing as he's eventually becoming a Kingsguard? What he's seeing is knights who I don't think we have any reason to doubt, at least for these initial Kingsguard, that they were probably pretty loyal to Jaehaerys. And they certainly, at least a few of them, stand with him when Rogar tries to separate him and Alysanne. So I think it's fair to say that they're probably pretty loyal to Jaehaerys. Some do end up dying for him, or at least on missions for him. So I think it is part loyalty. I think it is absolutely skill at arms. But I think it's also, and we'll talk about this as we continue, they're also operating in an age of at least apparent chivalry. This is operating in an age where there aren't major conflicts to deal with, certainly major conflicts to deal with respect to the king. This is not an era, in other words, comparable to, say, Aerys II's reign or Aegon IV or someone like that. Not to say that I don't have problems with Jaehaerys, that's a different topic, but this is a little bit of a different age to compare. And so what Ryam is growing up with is a king who is, at least outwardly and for the members of his Kingsguard, very easy to serve, and someone who they could show both devotion and skill at arms to.
Yeah, right on. Now, this is something we occasionally see from time to time in real life, in stories, etc. Brothers, siblings, really, but in this case, brothers, relatively close in age, who are all on the same track. In this case, knighthood. They have similar values and day-to-day lives. They had a very similar upbringing in terms of what values and goals and attainable things that you're supposed to do in your life, all that stuff. These young Redwyne brothers are dreaming of their future in that lifestyle, with that profession. And they might also be imagining something like the War of the White, or the War for the White, rather, another tournament to be in the Kingsguard, or something similar to that is a way for them to show off their prowess. Maybe even an actual war. I don't know if they were hoping for that. That's an odd thing to hope for. But, one of the things, if there is a war, I'm going to go prove myself. So, but tournaments is such a big part of their lifestyle in the Reach, as we said. It's such a long-standing, it's like the number one sport. It's like the football of Westeros, the by far the most popular thing. So shining in that is the biggest thing you can do in your life. So yeah, that's really interesting that this is probably already at a very young age. It's the main focus of their entire life.
No, absolutely. And I think when you point out the War for the White Cloaks, it is a really interesting event, not only because it leads to the choosing of these Kingsguard, but also because this would still have been very recent news when the young Redwyne brothers are getting to court. This is happening the year before they get there. So I don't think everyone suddenly forgot that this was a thing that happened. I think this is something that was still famous and still talked about and still marveled at as to how many knights competed and how well the winners did and how they got chosen. And so if you're the young Redwyne brothers, especially Ryam, who are growing up at this point, it's like you almost literally had this front row seat to the best of, as far as I could tell, the best of what chivalry had to offer. That this is an era where, perhaps for the first time in the 50-odd years of Targaryen monarchy, the Kingsguard is something to aspire to. The Kingsguard is something that's famous in its own right. The Kingsguard is something that a young boy can dream of joining. They may be in the first or second generation of boys who are growing up wanting to wear that white cloak, and now they've got this example where, yeah, you can. If you are skilled enough at arms and you do show enough loyalty to the king, you too can dream of wearing that white cloak and being one of the most famous and illustrious knights of your age.
Yeah, this is, of course, all sparked by Bran's early dreams of being a Knight of the Kingsguard. And he's a Stark of Winterfell. Can you imagine how different and how much more intense and frequent a boy in the Arbor or elsewhere in the Reach really would follow a similar path or have similar dreams? And as you say, it's a relatively new path. Not knighthood, obviously, but the Kingsguard. And it makes so much sense that Knights of the Reach and the other knightly regions, Stormlands, the Vale, the West, and the Riverlands, of course, they're, of course, aspiring to this because they're all knights. It's a very knightly thing. It's a knightly order. They love, like, in the upcoming book, we know that they're making up this new order of winged knights, and everybody's so excited. They all love the idea. They all want to be one of these new things. So it's a similar vibe, but in this case, it's a lot more regal than that. It's a little bit more established, and it's built on that anchor of long tradition.
Look, think of the Manderleys. They've been gone from the Reach for 1,000 years, and yet what is one of their titles that they're still clinging to? Knights of the Order of the Green Hand. This still matters to them because it's got that cachet. It's got that prestige to it. And I think you're right. This is something that they can dream of growing up, and I don't think it's... Well, I should say, I think it's worth considering as well that it's not just the Kingsguard themselves, although that is very important. It's also the king himself. We already mentioned the fact that Rickard was literally knighted by Jaehaerys, which is a huge deal. George R. Martin compares getting a knighthood from a king or a prince or a famous knight to, like, getting a degree from Harvard. No, it doesn't mean that you have any more of a college degree than someone else, but it carries a name, it carries a cachet, and similar here. If you're knighted by a king, well, that's a big deal. That's something that you can carry. And this isn't just any king. This is a king who, remember, he's not the old king yet. He's in his mid-20s at this point.
Okay.
He's a king who's training every day with his Kingsguard, who takes personal martial training extremely seriously. He's a doughty fighter in his own right. And so for young Ryam and his brothers, too, I think there's a way in which they may have felt like they were sort of growing up in, and I'll use a real-world sort of comparison here, kind of growing up in Westerosi Camelot. You've got this illustrious king, you've got his great Kingsguard, you've got the knights around him. It seems like this palace of chivalry where everyone is noble and great and knighthood is celebrated. Of course, as a young man and growing up to be a knight, Ryam is going to dream of joining the Kingsguard, because who wouldn't in that context?
Yeah, you're right. It's a very well-trodden path, and he was in the VIP lane, and both because of his birth and his skill set. And as you said, just his younger brother or older brothers, that's a long-standing thing in families. Siblings, we get the youngest sibling, especially if the elder siblings are all following the same path, they have a bar to exceed. It isn't just their father and grandfather who set that bar. The bar set by their own siblings seems to be more of what you aim for, the thing that's more in your lane personally. So I love that, how this fits into this so well, the way George has crafted the context for this character. So yeah, he didn't just grow up on the Arbor. He grew up in the Arbor and at court around this Westerosi Camelot, which I think is a fantastic way to put it. It is just so perfect. You've got like you said, the Kingsguard practicing with the king. Yeah, of course you want to be part of that. That's the best it ever was, probably. You don't know when you're living in the golden years but they were living in the golden years, and we will have to wonder later when he's older if he's going to look back on that and be like, yeah, those were the golden years, weren't they? But we're not there yet. Knighthood. We don't know exactly when Ryam was knighted, but he was knighted by 58 AC because, as you said earlier, he was in Jaehaerys' 10th year anniversary tournament, and that meant he was a knight by then. So, in other words, we can narrow it down. But of more interest in that, of course, is how well he did and what that led to.
I think that this is probably, if not the first, one of the first major events that he's showing off in front of the royal couple. Yes, there may have been small tourneys, or, some of the knights who were practicing the royal couple may have been watching them, but this is the first time that we hear about a big tourney that the royal couple is staging that Ryam is competing in. And what a showing to come out for his first big tourney, because in his successive tilts, he beats Ronald Baratheon, he beats Arthur Oakheart, he beats Salmon Dondarrion, he beats Harris Hogg, he beats Lawrence Roxton, and he beats Lucamore Strong. And that's a lot of names, and these are not slouches. Simon Dondarrion just won the Dragon Pit tourney. He probably beat Robert Redwyne to win it. Lawrence Roxton had been one of the victors in the War for the White Cloaks. Harris Hogg and Lucamore Strong had competed in the melee at the Dragon Pit tourney, and Lucamore actually won that. So these are not your local yokels that Ryam is beating. These are very talented knights in their own right. So the idea that this late teens, maybe early mid-20s Ryam is besting all of them, I think that's showing a lot of talent on his part. And yeah, I think the obvious comparison here is Loras in A Game of Thrones, when he's doing so spectacularly well in the Tourney of the Hand. Even though he's quite young as well, he's beating night after night, and he's winning very easily, both because he's very talented, but also because he's using very clever tactics.
And they're both third sons. We'll come back to
Exactly.
We'll come back to this Loras comparison. It's very rich, but we'll stick to our timeline for now.
So I think it's obvious he's got talent, but he doesn't just have jousting talent. I think Ryam also had what we might call showmanship. He knows how to work the crowd. He knows how to play on how talented he is, because not only does he win, but what does he do to name of Queen of Love and Beauty? Why, of course, he names the queen herself, Queen Alysanne. Now, to be clear, naming a Queen of Love and Beauty doesn't automatically mean that the knight in question has some sort of romantic or sexual interest in the woman in question. It can, but it doesn't have to. I mean, think of Barristan at the tourney of Harrenhal. What does he think of later? Who would he have named had he won? His first two thoughts are Queen Rhaella and Princess Elia. It's not because he was romantically interested in either of them. It's because they are literally the highest ranking women in the country. So of course it would be quite natural for a Kingsguard to look to these two most senior royal women to honor at this big tournament. We have other examples of this too. Simon Dondarrion wins and he names Princess Daenerys, who's a toddler. Again, he's not showing romantic interest, he's honoring the king and queen. Same thing with Criston Cole when King Viserys first becomes king and Rhaenyra is about 7 years old. Criston Cole wins and he gives Rhaenyra the victor's laurel. It's not because he's showing romantic interest in Rhaenyra, certainly not in that moment. He's showing honor to the king who just came into his throne by honoring the daughter that he clearly loves. And so I think Ryam is operating in a very similar way here.
I agree. And he probably, as you said, on the matter of showmanship, knew what to say, knew how to put it, came from a kind of family that would know how to craft the right speech if he wanted help with it. For example, he may have just been naturally charismatic. And this is an interesting idea and thing to consider. You mentioned Loras and being cunning, and there is something to be said for self-marketing when you are a famous hero, or at some point famous hero. He's not there yet, obviously. And that is something that he may have had a talent for. Not to say he didn't deserve his recognition, but he may have nudged it a bit forward. And that might be why he ended up number one instead of, just among the best, all right, of his era. So it's interesting to consider. We obviously can't know for sure, but fun to think about.
No, I agree. And I think that this is Ryam certainly knowing what the soft power of politics looks like and knowing how to work that. Queen Alysanne is beloved. She is very much loved by the commons. Everyone knows Queen Alysanne. She's well known for her charity and her love for the people. So by giving the crown of the Queen of Love and Beauty to Alysanne, what is Ryam saying? I have no romantic interest. I have no lover. I have no woman I want to marry. I want to devote my life to my most celebrated queen. I want to devote my life to the crown. If he's not literally thinking of joining the Kingsguard by this point, although he may have, this is a pretty good advertisement for him. This is saying, look at me. I am devoting my life to you as the royal couple.
It's so perfect because if they look into it, they realize just how perfect he is. Third son, devoted to this, comes from the chivalric tradition that produces the type of people that they're looking for. The knights who would be devoted to this. It's not something they just say. They literally do grow up with these values. It's not just something they pay lip service to. Maybe some of them do, but it's believable that he is genuinely focused with all of his being on this goal of becoming a Kingsguard knight. And that's something that they would notice and go, yes, this guy is perhaps a candidate. Whatever he thought his future might be, he had certainly a bright future, whatever it was going to turn out. His start to life was good. He had been knighted. His brothers were doing well. And we'll move forward to the next phase now. Kingsguard. The Golden Age was interrupted by a horrible event. Even Golden Ages can have really terrible moments. And this one happened to work out in a sense for Ryam because it was the Shivers, and that killed a lot of people, including a couple of Kingsguard. So, yeah, let's see what happened next. Take us away, Nina.
I think you put it really well to say that this is sort of a very abrupt end to what might have been this early Golden Age of Jaehaerys, or apparent Golden Age of Jaehaerys' reign. The Shivers is devastating. We know that this is a pandemic that hits Westeros very hard and hits King's Landing very hard. Now, we don't know if Ryam was actually there or if he left for the Arbor or somewhere else, but we know the people who are in King's Landing, they're being affected very badly by this disease. And it's not making distinctions between high and low. It's not making distinctions between people that Ryam wouldn't know and people that he did. In fact, there are definitely people that Ryam would have known who were dying of this disease. Princess Daenerys, we mentioned her a little bit before. Ryam absolutely would have known her as a member of the royal family. He also definitely would have known Albin Massey. He worked with his father on the small council. And as you say, there are Kingsguard who are dying too. And although we don't know it, I wouldn't be surprised if some of Ryam's friends were dying, or friends of his brothers, or friends of his fathers who are dying in this. Again, this is a devastating disease. So I think it may have really affected Ryam and sort of perhaps made him question a bit, what does my future look like and what am I doing? This is sort of the first big tragedy, so to speak, that may have affected his life.
Absolutely. I think the Knights of Summer phrase is perfect for this because, as you say, everything was so great and then it wasn't. And they had to learn that life isn't a song. Seeing people die of a horrible disease is about as sobering as it gets in terms of if you thought you were living in a song, you might look back on it and go, I was living in a song, seeing all this happen. This is not a song that anyone wants to hear. Not this one. This would be a terrible song. And death by disease as a person who wants to be a knight, it's super unnerving. I mean, you want to die in battle. I mean, you don't want to die, but you want, when you do die, to be a brave death, a noble death, which dying in your bed to a disease that's just so ignoble. And in that sense, it's terrifying to them because it undermines what they expect to be in life. It undermines the lifestyle that their whole life is built on, their whole view of what the world is.
No, I agreed. Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, the job of the Kingsguard is to die for the king. That is what you sign up for when you're a Kingsguard, is if and when the king's life is in danger, you're the one who, to use a bad modern metaphor, takes the bullet for the king instead of the king himself. So the idea that Ser Sam Good and Sir Victor the Valiant are dying in their bed, I think it would have been shocking both to them, obviously, but also to Ryam, to see these great knights who won in the war for the White Cloaks, who are so apparently, brave and militarily capable, and they're just dying of something that they have no control over, and they have no way to die for the king. They're dying on their own alone. I think that would have been really unnerving, obviously horrible for them, but also shocking for Ryam.
So let's get specific. What happened here in terms of the Kingsguard and the shuffling around with the shivers?
Right. So we mentioned Ser Sam Good of Tower Hill and Sir Victor the Valiant die from the shivers. And so now Jaehaerys has 2 open slots. He obviously has to fill them. And so what does he need to do? Well, he needs to find knights. Obviously, the king and the Lord Commander can only name knights that they know. They can't name knights of the Kingsguard that they don't know about. So they need to look around and they need to find replacements. And it's doubly hard because now you're trying to replace what is a little less than a third of the Kingsguard all of a sudden. And people that Jaehaerys knew personally and liked personally. So it's a doubly hard task for him. And we know from Gildane that it's Giles Morgan, who's the Lord Commander, who suggests Ryam along with Robin Shaw as these replacements. It's also notable, and this is not related to the Kingsguard, but again, as you put it, it's a disease that does have some, let's say, beneficial outcomes for the Redwynes. It's not just Ryam who benefits, it's also his brother Robert, because he's named as commander of the City Watch in place of Carl Corbray, who also died of the shivers. So even though this is a devastating disease, and I don't want to lessen that impact in any way, shape, or form, or how it might have impacted Ryam, or Robert for that matter, I do think this is also an opportunity for the Redwynes to step into more royal favor.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great point. And they're getting the offices that they aimed for. When they arrived, the 3 squires at court, they knew, of course, the eldest would go back to be Lord of the Arbor someday, and the other 2 had all the opportunity to make their place. And now we see that happen abruptly. They might have worked their way into that over the long term, but the shivers catapulted them forward in the timeline. So they didn't have to, the ladder that they had to climb got a lot shorter. And are we supposed to think that Ryam's choice was just obvious, or is that maybe taking it too far?
No, I think it was probably pretty obvious.
Okay.
Again, they're choosing from probably a relatively small pool. Yes, the Kingsguard is officially supposed to be a meritocracy. You're supposed to get in by your merits according to the King and Lord Commander. But as with any institution in Westeros, there are deeply classist elements to it, and there's also deeply biased elements to it. And to put it quite bluntly, Ryam is there and he's got all the right credentials. Yes, he's young, but he's not so incredibly young that I think that would have been held against him, especially by a king who is himself only in his mid to late 20s at this point. Someone who's in his late teens or early 20s by this time probably doesn't seem so incredibly young that he doesn't belong in the Kingsguard, so to speak. And again, Jaehaerys just saw him perform so spectacularly at this anniversary tourney, where he's not just showing off his skills as a jouster, although obviously that was there, but also his very public devotion to the crown. Both things that, as you point out before, are very important to consider for a king or a lord commander in a new member of the Kingsguard. And also, and you mentioned this before, he is the youngest of 3 brothers, so it's not like his appointment is going to be offensive to Lord Manfred. In fact, it actually might be welcome to him. We hear about this in A Storm of Swords when Littlefinger is explaining why he suggested that Loras take the White and become a Kingsguard. He mentions that one of the advantages is that Mace Tyrell doesn't have to find him lands or a bride. Same thing for Manfred. He no longer has to find a job or a holding or a wife for this third son of his if he joins the Kingsguard while still having his heir and his spare. So I think all of that made a lot of sense to Jaehaerys and to Sir Giles as they're looking for a replacement for these two dead Kingsguard.
Yeah, they really just fit the bill in a number of ways, didn't they? Other examples real quick of third sons who joined the Kingsguard. Like she already said, Loras Tyrell, that's a perfect one. Eric or Arik, good chance one of them was the third son.
Probably.
If there was two brothers or one brother ahead, then one of them was the third son. Or like, say, Benjen Stark, if we're using an example from a different order where you give up your family and claims. So that's similar to the Kingsguard. Waymar Royce, another example, the first noble character we see in the entire series. Also a third son. Now, let's summarize the, shall we put it, standing of House Redwyne here now that Ryam is in the Kingsguard, because it's a lot. It's even stronger than it was when we talked about it a little while ago.
And I think this is also coming into that calculus of what makes Ryam a good choice for being a Kingsguard. This is a family that's already, in certainly Jaehaerys' mind, proven its loyalty to the crown for more than a decade. We talked about how they declared for Jaehaerys instead of Maegor at the end of Maegor's reign. We talk about the fact that Manfred was serving, apparently pretty well, as Master of Ships for Jaehaerys. Jaehaerys had personally knighted Ryam's brother Rickard during the Dragon Pit tourney. And again, we talked about how Ryam showed off how loyal he was to Alysanne and the crown during that anniversary tourney. So this is a family that Jaehaerys has every reason to believe is incredibly loyal to him and is not going to betray him and is going to serve him admirably. So why not make its youngest son one of his Kingsguard? There's no reason for Jaehaerys not to think that Ryam wouldn't die for him if and when the need arose.
You know, he didn't have a nickname that we know of, which a lot of these famous guys have that. Not all of them do. One reason he might not have had one is his name already kind of rolls off the tongue. So Ryam Redwyne, it's already so nice. Like, again, everything about this guy is perfect. Like, geez. But if I were to give him a nickname, he's a Kingsguard from House Redwyne, so that would have to be White Wine. Right?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness.
Arbor Gold? Yeah, no. Arbor Gold Wine? No. Yeah. How can it be?
You quit while you're behind.
How could it be? Anyway. All right, let's move on to our next section. This one's called As a New Brother. The year after Ryam became a member of the Kingsguard, we had what is sometimes referred to as the Third Dornish War. It wasn't a full-scale civil war. It was something, but it was something of a family affair, I think we could say.
No, I think that's right. And we hear from Gyldain that even though officially, or maybe academically, it's referred to as the Third Dornish War, popularly it's remembered as Lord Rogar's War. And I don't agree with Gyldain on a lot of things, but I do agree that that's probably a more fitting name. Because it wasn't really a war between the Iron Throne as the Targaryen government and Sunspear as the Dornish or Martell government, as much as it was a war between Rhaegar Baratheon and his outlaw brother Borys, who just joined up with the Vulture King. And we know that Rhaegar took about 500 men into the Red Mountains, and Jaehaerys flew above them on Vermithor to try to root out Borys and also root out the Vulture King. Now, we don't know if Ryam was among those 500 men. Gyldain doesn't mention any Kingsguard being part of this. That doesn't mean they weren't. It just means that we don't know. I do think it would be a little strange if Jaehaerys is personally going to war here and he doesn't have at least one member of his Kingsguard. Again, practically he does have Vermithor, I understand that, but also I think the optics would have seemed a little strange if the king is going off to war and all 7 of his sworn Kingsguard who are bound to die for him are sitting back home in King's Landing. Whether or not that means Ryam would have gone, that I'm a little less certain on, because at this point he would have been the newest Kingsguard along with Robin Shaw. He still would have been quite young. I think it would have made more sense if Jaehaerys did take any of his Kingsguard with him, to take one of the more senior Kingsguards, someone that he had known a little bit longer, someone who was a little more experienced, someone who would know what to do with the king, as opposed to the quote-unquote the new recruit.
Absolutely. There's a lot of sense to the idea that he would have gone because take the best warrior, but it's not that simple. Like you say, there's seniority, and Jaehaerys would be aware of such things. He wouldn't necessarily want to offend the knights who have been around for a while. It's not like they hadn't earned their chance to be at his side, because that is something they want to do. They want to be there. They're going out, and wars are rare. These are brave men. They want to do their job. And the best job in that moment is being at his side, not back at the castle. They'll do which job they're told, obviously, but the best job at that moment was to go fight in that war. That's the exciting one. That's the one where you can make a name for yourself. But in this case, no Kingsguard did make a name for themselves because there's no mention of such. Vermithor did an awful lot by himself there, and of course, Jaehaerys did spend not all of his time in the air, but as an aside, that's an interesting question. How did the Kingsguard function in the era of when the dragons actually existed versus now, where now it's simple. They're just always around the king, but before they're like, well, I can't be around him when he's up there, so I just got to try to be where he's going to land and then guard him from there. So yeah, it must have been a little trickier.
But at the same time, the only one that can attack the king on a dragon is, well, usually another dragon. So
yeah.
I guess it does kind of lead to a strange reminder of the division of loyalty of, can you defend a Targaryen from another Targaryen?
Yeah, that is a tough one.
That's an entire philosophical question we don't have time to get into.
Yep. So Ryam would have certainly been there in the year 62 when the king named Aemon, his eldest son, Prince of Dragonstone. That's a pretty big ceremony, pretty big deal, and it's a place that we couldn't assume he'd be elsewhere for.
Absolutely. I'm going to assume that all 7 members of the Kingsguard are here for this. This is a really big deal. This is a really big celebration at court. Not only because it's acknowledging Aemon as heir, certainly it is, but I think it also may have been the moment where Aemon is transitioning into his beginning of his martial training. This is around about the age that aristocratic Westerosi boys start to become pages and squires. They're not obviously going to be knighted tomorrow, but they're starting to learn the rudiments of military training and also the rudiments of chivalry. We see this with Bran, again, in Game of Thrones. He's about 7, and he's allowed to spar, albeit in a very formalized and very unmartial way with Tommen when the royal party comes to Winterfell. So I think it's very possible that in this moment, Aemon would have been beginning his martial training. And in that sense, I could see where if Aemon wasn't literally squiring for Ryam, he may have been working with Ryam very closely in terms of learning aspects of knighthood and aspects of chivalry from Ryam Redwyne. Think about, for example, again, return to Loras in A Feast for Crows. What does Cersei see him doing? He's training Tommen. He's training Tommen how to joust, the very basic steps of how to joust. I think there may have been a similar relationship between Aemon and Ryam. Aemon's maybe roughly about 15 years younger than Ryam, give or take. So I think he may have been looking to Ryam as sort of an older brother figure, someone that he can look to, this illustrious example of, here's what it means to be a great knight, here's what it means to be a member of the Kingsguard, and this is who I can learn from to become a great knight myself one day.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially if you consider Aemon's personality on top of all that, because he was a very serious, good-natured, well-mannered prince, and that could be the influence of a chivalric, popular Kingsguard who had a big influence on him and someone that he wanted to be like. It makes a lot of sense. So, again, we might have been back to either a second Golden Age or just back to the original Golden Age after that interruption by the Shivers, because the next basically 10 years, which would be the first 10 years of Ryam's Kingsguard service, things went pretty well for quite a while, and that may have, just felt like another set of golden years, and it kind of was.
No, agreed. I mean, this is, if you're going to serve as a Kingsguard any time, this is a pretty good time to serve as a Kingsguard. There's really no major wars. There's no really difficult challenges for the Kingsguard to face. The Targaryen family is growing, so there's more and more princes and princesses. The realm's at peace. Jaehaerys is starting to work on his road construction, and there's enough security and stability and prosperity throughout the realm that we see tourneys being celebrated throughout the kingdom. And these are opportunities that Ryam gets to show off more of his jousting skills. He gets to attend more of these events and really develop in that knighthood. So we hear, for example, that Lord Darklan hosts a tourney in 72 AC to celebrate his marriage. Gildan doesn't say that Ryam specifically attended, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did, given that both Aemon and Balon go and they participate in the Squires tourney. I think it would be very unusual for both of the king's male heirs to go to a tourney and to not have at least one member of the Kingsguard with them. I mean, again, compare the Hedge Knight. We've got 6 Targaryen princes going to Ashford, and they've got 3 Kingsguard going with them. So I have to think at least one Kingsguard was going with these teenage princes to Lord Darklan's wedding tourney. And again, although we don't hear of Ryam going, I think it's very possible that he would have heard about this great tourney and would have thought, I want to compete. I want to show off my skills. I want to keep honing these skills. And I want to compete against the best that Westeros has to offer, at least that is able to go to this tournament. So he very well may have competed. We don't hear about it. What we do hear about, though, is that Aemon is knighted at this tourney. So I think it's very possible. We don't know who knights Aemon, but I think it's very possible that if Aemon was knighted at this tourney as he was, Ryam would have been the one to do it. And again, why not? This is by this point, already famous Kingsguard knight. He's well known. He's got those aristocratic credentials. I don't think anyone would have looked askance at Ryam, who is now probably in his 30s, knighting this teenage prince.
It's very fitting, and I would have a little more confidence in this estimation than I do about our prior guests, because in this case, it makes a lot of sense for the royal family to send the Kingsguard who is most likely to win the tournament, because part of the point of sending a Kingsguard, other than the obvious duty of the Kingsguard guarding the princes in this case, they want to remind the realm of the strength of the Kingsguard. This is part of the reason to let them compete in the first place, to tell everybody, oh yeah, the Kingsguard they're great knights. You know, that needs to be pointed out every once in a while, especially when there's 10 years without a war or anything like that. They bring glory to the royal family, and that if they're going to do that, yes, I'm the guy who's best. So I like this idea, because Ryam, by this time, not unlikely to have established himself as the best. He wasn't a legend yet, although maybe he was, but he would have certainly been very well known by this point. His prowess would be known realm-wide. I mean, in the north, they had already heard of Loras Tyrell in the span of the books. So if they're hearing of Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, when he's 16, I guarantee this guy in his 30s, in this era when there's lots of talking and lots of tournaments, and it's the talk of the main thing to talk about, rather. Yeah, he's super famous, I can imagine. There was another tournament worthy of mention here, right? We have the tournament of 73 AC in Old Oak, which is, of course, the lands of the Oakhearts. And this one is worthy of mention as well.
I think, so we hear about this tournament. This time only Prince Balon goes. Prince Aemon does not go. Now, he does officially go as a mystery knight, the quote-unquote the Silver Fool. So he is a mystery knight. It's possible that the king wouldn't have sent him with a Kingsguard, or that Balon himself didn't want to go with a Kingsguard because he didn't want to sort of give the game away, so to speak. That being said, I don't think it's impossible that a Kingsguard, and even specifically Ryam, may have still gone. After all, we can look at something like the Mystery Knight. Dunk and Egg meet, who eventually ends up being revealed as Daemon the Younger Blackfire on the road. He's pretending to be the humble knight Sir John Fiddler, and he's got Alan Cockshaw with him, who is a de facto member of his Kingsguard, so to speak. So I think it's possible that the king and or Balon still would have brought one of the Kingsguard with him, even if it wasn't going officially, even if he himself was also in disguise, just to make sure that nothing happened to the prince, just to make sure that he was still kept safe, even though he is in disguise as this mystery knight. And again, in that case, I think that it's possible that Ryam was a natural choice, because This is attorney at Old Oak in the Reek. Ryam probably knew Lord Oakheart. He's probably been to Old Oak before. In fact, his brother is there. Rickard Redwyne is the one to unhorse and subsequently knight Aemon. So I think it's very possible that Ryam would have gone, and I think it's an amusing coincidence if Ryam is the one to knight Aemon and Rickard is the one to knight Aemon.
That would be funny. Yeah, I guess that's one point against this idea, if he might be too famous by this point. But that doesn't mean they know what he looks like, because this is an era where people still don't know what they necessarily know what each other looks like because of the nature of not having, phones and cameras and all that stuff. So I also like this idea because it gives us, as another comparison to Barristan Selmy, of which there are many here, the idea that maybe he had his own little Arstan Whitebeard adventure, not nearly as serious as that, but disguising himself to keep an eye on a younger member of the royal family, and hijinks ensue. Just nightly things, yeah. So again, somewhat of an idyllic situation he's in. This is the most dramatic thing that happens. A Kingsguard knight maybe in disguise helping a prince in disguise enter a tournament under an assumed name. I mean, that's the big drama of the day. It's pretty fun, but it's obviously not the level of, the new Long Night or an invasion of the Squishers or something like that. So let's go to a more uncomfortable topic for the Kingsguard, because, it's not going to be as bad as the Shivers, but it's important. It's a different kind of problem. It's a lusty brother. In 73 AC, later in that year, after this tournament in Old Oak, probably, Ryam had his first personal challenge that we know of as a Kingsguard knight. A problem that you definitely can't solve with swords, not the traditional kind of enemy, something more personal than that.
So what happens is that Ryam Redwyne discovers that Lucamore Strong, who is also a member of the Kingsguard, one of his sworn brothers, had secretly, quote-unquote, married several different women.
We don't need to tell y'all that's a no-no. So tell us what happened. How did Ryam figure it out? And I mean, not that having two wives is something that you can really keep under wraps forever, but
there's certain aspects we don't know of this, and it leads to interesting speculation. Obviously, we know that despite the official vows of the Kingsguard, there are any number of Kingsguard knights throughout the history of the institution that have taken lovers outside of their vows. We hear about Barristan, for example. He says Lewin Martell kept a paramour, and he absolutely knew about it. Aerys Oakheart mentions that he knew Preston Greenfield and Boris Blount absolutely had women that they were sleeping with, and obviously Aerys himself is sleeping with Arianne. So it's probably not something... Now, we don't hear about this necessarily before the era of Ryam and Lucamore, so I don't know if this was happening before then, but it's very possible that it was. So it probably wouldn't have been hard for Ryam to notice if Lucamore was gone for multiple nights without explanation, or maybe a flimsy sort of explanation. After all, they're living together. They're going to see each other constantly. So if all of a sudden Lucamore is disappearing at odd hours and he doesn't really have a good reason for it, well, yeah, Ryam's eyebrow might be raised a bit. That being said, to find out that he was married to a few different women, I think that Ryam probably may have had to tail him a bit to, kind of follow him a little bit private eye style and figure out what he was actually doing. But it's also possible, and it's not mutually exclusive, that Lucamore told Ryam directly. And why not, perhaps, in Lucamore's mind? This is his sworn brother. There's no secrets among the sworn brothers. You tell each other everything, and maybe Lucamore was operating under the assumption that Ryam would keep a secret.
Yeah, he might have thought that. Obviously, he made a mistake because Ryam turned out to be a snitch. I think it's important to know, like you said, the examples we have, besides this one, the ones that are in more current times, come after the Kingsguard has existed for 300 years. There's a little, maybe a corrosion of their values. But in this era, it's all shiny and new, and there isn't an acceptance of people breaking the rules necessarily. And of course, this is a guy that grew up in that shiny Camelot-like realm where everything's perfect, and this just doesn't fit with that. So, he had to say something. So he didn't turn the other way. He reported to the Lord Commander.
No, he did. And to me, this is a really decisive moment in terms of looking at Ryam as a character and as a multidimensional figure, because Lucamore Strong isn't a stranger. He's not a random person that Ryam is turning in for justice. This is someone that Ryam has probably known for the better part of 20 years and has been serving on the Kingsguard for years and years at this point. I mean, Lucamore came to notice in 55 AC at the Dragon Pit tourney. That's a good almost 2 decades before this is happening. So there's no way that Ryam doesn't know Lucamore personally. This is someone that he has been seeing every single day, especially since he's become a Kingsguard. And again, Ryam could have said nothing. Barristan doesn't seem to have ever said anything in his own time to, Hightower or any of the other Kingsguard Knight he served with that Lewin Martell had a paramour. Aerys Oakheart didn't seem to say anything to Barristan or anyone else that Preston Greenfield and Boris Blount were sleeping with other people. So Ryam theoretically could have said nothing. He could have just kept it and let the chips fall where they may, so to speak. But he doesn't. He chooses to tell Giles Morrigan, maybe guessing that nothing good would come of this, but doing it anyway. I can't imagine, at the very least, Ryam didn't think that the king and queen are not going to be pleased to hear this, and that Lucamore's life is going to change, and it's probably not going to be for the better.
Yeah, it's a puzzle because we have to wonder what Ryam was thinking in the moment when he decided to turn his brother in. Was it just a matter of he felt it was important to keep the institution pure, that it was his duty as a knight of the Kingsguard, that his duty to the king and the royal family exceeded his duty to his brother? Or perhaps it was just because there was no precedent and he didn't know what the punishment would be, and maybe he imagined Sir Lucamore would just have something lesser happen to him. And because his punishment was rather awful. But the darkest thought I could offer here is that if Ser Ryam was secretly a bit more cunning than we want to think, or than we're aware of, because if he's really cunning, you wouldn't necessarily know it by the sources. Sir Lucamore was famous. He had won the melee tournament. He was handsome and also probably did well in the tournaments. So, getting a rival out of the way for good is a possible angle here. Probably not, but if you want to think on the lowest level here, that would be something he could have been thinking. But what else do you think could have been on his mind? What would have been the conflict here? What's going back and forth in his head?
Well, and I think that certainly there's a less harsh way maybe that we can think about it that Ryam may not have officially known. Because to your point, there's not really a precedent for this sort of thing happening, and he was a favorite, Lucamore, of the king and queen. So it's possible that Ryam thought, yeah, well, maybe he'll be punished, but it won't be too severe. The king and queen will take into account that they really like this guy and that this really hasn't happened before. So maybe it won't be too much of a punishment, but he still needs something because he did break the rules. But again, this is not a world where this type of infraction is lightly handled. And this is not just he has a single lover. This is multiple women that he's not just taken as lovers, but he's obviously unofficially married, which you're definitely not allowed to do as a Kingsguard. And so that may have been a lot harder to hush up or to pardon. But, it's interesting you mentioned the darkest thought that you have is he's trying to get rid of a rival. Because to me, the darkest thought is that Ryam knew exactly what would happen and was okay with it because he believed that the Kingsguard mattered more than this person, that the institution and the reputation of the Kingsguard and the monarchy mattered more than this individual. Now, why he believed that, I don't know. Maybe he's trying to save his own skin because he doesn't want to be accused of hiding or hushing up an affair. Maybe he thinks he's going to be rewarded, but maybe, and again, I kind of fall this way, and it's certainly not a generous thought to have, maybe Ryam genuinely believed the Kingsguard is all important, the crown is all important, and someone who has sullied the reputation of either or both of those institutions, they need to be punished, and it doesn't matter what my relationship is to them.
It's the proverbial true believer of sorts. Yeah, someone who is just doesn't have any tolerance for a lessening of the rules or any sort of leeway, which might be an important thing for us to consider later in his life. We'll keep that thought in mind as his career advances. One other idea in terms of just getting ahead would be that maybe Lucamore was a competitor to be the next Lord Commander eventually. He might have seen it that way. Either way, Lucamore kind of dug his own grave. And before he dug his own grave, we're told something very awful, that he was gelded by his own sworn brothers. Yikes, right?
Yeah, that is an awful thought. Now, I will give a little bit of context. Aris Oakheart mentions this to Arianne. This is not something that Gildane repeats. I don't mean to suggest that it didn't happen, but it's something that we have to take into context. It's possible that what Aris Oakheart meant was that it's either a story that's been exaggerated, that this happened, and now the story that's come down through the centuries is that the actual Kingsguard brothers did it themselves, or that this is supposed to be taken metaphorically. In other words, the actions of his own brothers led to this happening to him. I don't know if either of those are what Aris Oakheart is supposed to have meant, but it is important to note that that's not something that's supported in Fire and Blood that's only coming for A Feast for Crows. That being said, if this is true, and again, this is what Aris Oakheart says happens, this is a really, really awful thing to happen. Not just that this is the punishment that is happening to Lucamore, but that his own sworn brothers, Ryam Redwyne included, are the ones that are doing this to him. I mean, think about comparison, and it's not exactly a formal comparison or a tight comparison, but think about Cersei in A Feast for Crows, who has the Blue Bard tortured. Or Ramsay, who practices, it's implied that he does a similar torture to Theon. These are awful. And even Cersei, who wants to have the Blue Bard tortured, thinks that it is so awful. Now, granted, she blames Marjorie for this, which is definitely not fair. But even she thinks it's awful. So now imagine you're Ryam Redwyne, and it's not enough that you've accused this person, but now the knife is literally or figuratively being put in your hand, and you're being told, now you do it. Now you mutilate this person that you've known for the better part of 2 decades. Now you torture them. That's gotta be a harrowing incident to go through.
Yeah, and that's why it's really dark to consider if he knew that would happen, and a much different idea if he didn't. And that's why we brought up the matter of precedent, because it is very possible he didn't know what sort of punishment would be inflicted here. He might have just thought he'd be sent to the wall, which he was sent to the wall, but after the gelding. So yeah, it would be horrible to witness, and it also provides context to these later Kingsguard who don't turn their brothers in, because they don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to geld my brother. I don't have to get anything to do with that. Yeah, that's a very straightforward thought of something. If I turn him in, then I got... Yeah, no. They'd have to really, unless they hate each other, then it's like, yeah, I'm getting him. That's...
Well, and I think it speaks to, and you alluded to this a little bit before, but sort of the flip side, the awful and horrible side of the Kingsguard, which is the demand for absolute devotion to the crown. Individual lives can't matter. Individual relationships can't matter when the most important thing is the crown and the reputation of the Kingsguard. And I think it's very possible that Ryam was one of those people. He's sort of that, if we can go back to the Maester Aemon comparison, he's that man in 10,000 who can put duty above love, who can say, no, the Kingsguard matters most, the crown matters most. I don't care if I've known you for 20 years. I don't care if you're my sworn brother. If you've injured those reputations, then you deserve the punishment as the king demands.
Yeah, it's a Stannis or sometimes a Ned or maybe Robb and Rickard Karstark type situation. George R. R. Martin loves to introduce and use these themes with his characters and plot lines because it creates that sort of interesting conflict that the characters have to deal with. The downsides of honor, the lack of compromise, while also making the ones who suffer for their honor, they're still sympathetic, even though there's all these downsides, like I said, things that they wouldn't normally do, things that they get put into between a rock and a hard place, like Ned having to choose between his daughter and his honor. Well, he made the choice easily, but his honor was important to him unless the life of his daughter is threatened. So this is not the same as a daughter, but they do call each other brothers. So there is a sense of brotherhood here that he has to violate, but on the other hand, he would have to violate his oath to the king. And yeah, this guy could have just been that hardcore, he He might not have felt bad about it. Like you said, he might have like, well, he broke the law. I don't feel bad for him. He made his own choice, or he might have been like,
Well, and, we talked a while back, I know there was the episode on Aemon the Dragonknight, and this was another point that got brought up. Was Aemon also that man in 10,000 who could put duty above love? I think he was. I think he was someone who, not to say he didn't love Nerys, but clearly he prioritized his duty to protect the absolutely awful person that Aegon IV was above the love that he had for his sister.
Later troubles. It's possible Ryam Redwyne fought for the crown in some of the later conflicts in Jaehaerys' reign. As usual, some of the Kingsguard are likely to be part of these conflicts. We're not always sure which ones, but it's often sensible to guess that the man considered perhaps the best fighter amongst the Kingsguard would have been one of the ones sent. Now, of course, this is more along the lines of the type of trouble that the average Kingsguard would want to face rather than the Lucamore the Lusty situation. So this is a bit more straightforward in that sense. The fourth Dornish War, we mentioned the third Dornish War earlier. Let's talk about the next one in 83 AC.
Now, this one, in a strange way, it's a little more formally a, quote-unquote Dornish War, even though it lasts a lot less time. So we hear about the Fourth Dornish War as basically a one-day war, because Morian Martell decides to invade the Stormlands, but spoiler alert, it doesn't go very well when he's bringing a navy and the Targaryens have dragons. Now, obviously, the bulk of the lion's share, dragon share, of the fighting is done by Jaehaerys and his sons on their dragons. But we do hear about Borman Baratheon assembling a land force to complement this draconic power, although it doesn't end up really being used. So whether or not the king decided some of his Kingsguard would be part of that, we don't know. But again, I think it's not illogical that would have happened. Number one, again, because of optics. I don't think it would have made a lot of sense if the king and his two male heirs are going to war and his Kingsguard are kicking back in King's Landing and sharing a drink together. I think there has to be at least some of them that, they can't literally be in the air with the king, but symbolically they are going to war with the king. And of course, there is precedent for Kingsguard leading attacks and leading armies during wartime, as we see very notably during Robert's Rebellion. So I think it's very possible that Ryam Redwyne was part of this army that Borman formed in order to fight the Dornish if there was a landing, which of course there wasn't. And it is worth pointing out, Borman is a relative of the royal family. He's not a Targaryen, to be clear, but he is a female line relative. So there is a way in which the king could have chosen to sort of extend that royal protection to this extended family member, so to speak, by having one of his Kingsguard with him, by saying, I'm recognizing you as a member of my extended family, and so I'm going to have my Kingsguard protect you. And again, Ryam is in his early 40s. That's certainly not too old to be a warrior in Westeros. He's very much an established member of the Kingsguard at this point. He's got that martial talent, so I don't think it's illogical to assume he would have been with this army.
I agree. If the Dornish had landed and started moving through the Stormlands, it's very forested, almost jungly, because it's the rainwood, right? It's so wet. They would have made the dragons doing their job would have been a lot harder, and it would have come down to the ground troops, and that would have been an entirely different matter. So yeah, they would have been prepared for that kind of occasion, even if it's not what actually played out. One place we can definitely identify Ryam as having been was in 89 AC, the end of a very long royal progress by Jaehaerys. It ended in Old Town, and of course, what did they do to celebrate? Lord Hightower staged a tournament. Shocking.
If you need a celebration in Westeros, you stage a tournament.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, if there's a big tournament and it's in this era, who's going to show up? Well, it's going to be Ryam Redwyne. Now, we don't know everyone who competed, but we know that Ryam did because he wins. Now, I think that this is a pretty big event. Obviously, the Hightowers are very wealthy. Obviously, Old Town is a very important seat. So I think, and this is a royal visit. So I think this would have been a pretty grand event. This probably would have brought the best and brightest who at least could attend to compete. And again, Ryam's getting up close to 50 probably at this point, if not past 50. So it says a lot about his talent as a jouster that he's still very easily holding his own, even into his 50s, against presumably much younger competitors and still winning at this big and impressive tournament. There's a comparison to make in Game of Thrones. Littlefinger has to acknowledge, even Littlefinger has to acknowledge how impressive it is that Barristan won a tourney at 57. So if we have Ryam Redwyne and he's winning a tourney in his 50s, I think it also would have been seen as very impressive.
Yeah, that would really get spoken of. And as you said, this is probably a huge affair because it's in Old Town. We know for sure the crowds would be huge, and big crowds means more witnesses. More witnesses means more people telling their friends, and this is a port city, so a lot of people that are getting on ships within the next few weeks would tell that story to whatever people they encountered in the next port, and the fame of Ryam Redwyne would spread ever further. The next event that he may have been a part of, there's another royal event here, the Myrish bloodbath. He may have accompanied the two princes. Both Aemon and Balon were a part of this one, and it didn't have a great ending, so it's a bit sad, and that is something that a Kingsguard has to face from time to time, the loss of a royal.
So this may be another opportunity that Ryam may have had to go to war. Even though Jaehaerys' reign is largely one of peace, there are these individual conflicts and these smaller wars, and it's very possible that Ryam would have fought in this. Again, there are land armies, even though obviously Aemon and then later Balon are taking part and they've got their dragons, there are still land armies with Borman Baratheon, with Cameron Tarth, with Corlys Velaryon. So there is definitely opportunity for someone who doesn't have a dragon, like a member of the Kingsguard, to join in the fray. And again, as we mentioned in the context of the tourneys, I think it would be very difficult for the king to justify sending one or both of his sons to war and not having at least one member of the Kingsguard with them. So again, you're sending off a member of the royal family without the obvious official protection that the royal family is supposed to have.
Absolutely. Yeah, and how are you going to do anything about a crossbow bolt, like sniper type situation? That was very unlikely, very unusual, not something that they may have prepared for, but it might have been something that they considered in terms of how their operational security plan worked from that point on. They may have considered crossbowmen and where one could be hidden anytime they're standing around. Like, well, where might a crossbowman? If I could take a shot from here? It may have changed how they, thought about guarding the princes from that point on. It would have been really bad, right? They would have felt guilty and, yeah.
I mean, I think of, and I've probably mentioned this before, but Barristan in A Dance with Dragons, he thinks about how disappointed in himself he is that so many kings died while he was a member of the Kingsguard and princes died and he couldn't save them. Again, not because he practically could have done anything about it. He can't make Jaehaerys II not sick. He can't make Aerys II not assassinated because he wasn't there. He couldn't have stopped Rhaegar from being killed by Robert. There's nothing practically he could have done, but he still feels guilty because, again, the fundamental job of the Kingsguard is to die for the king or the member of the royal family. You're supposed to be able to take that bullet, or in this case, that crossbow. So I think that there may have been a lot of guilt for Ryam to say, why is Aemon, this illustrious prince, this great prince who should have been a great king, why is he dead and I'm still alive? That doesn't make any sense. The chivalric math isn't mathing on that one.
It's true. They are going to hold themselves to a high standard. And if we consider maybe that there's some vanity here, a Kingsguard wouldn't want that on their record, a stain that, a king died or a prince either died while they were there, so that would be, it wouldn't look good, and that's someone like Ryam might really care about that.
No, I mean, remember I forget the context, but thinking about the Kingsguard when Daeron, the young dragon, was attacked, and one of them, to his eternal shame, surrendered while Daeron died. Yeah. That's how it's feeling, is if the king is dead and you're not as a member of the Kingsguard, something is fundamentally wrong with you in the eyes of Westerosi.
There may have been a second shame here as well, which is that Prince Balon was so angered and traumatized by his brother's death that he basically dismounted his dragon and went down on the ground and slaughtered a lot of these Myrish soldiers, didn't allow them to surrender, gave them no quarter. If he's going down into the trenches like that, fighting with Dark Sister, which is probably what he did, he probably picked up his brother's sword, because Aemon had Dark Sister at that point. He would also have probably been the heir that actually ended up being controversial, but in the moment, that distinction is irrelevant. He's the eldest Targaryen there. He's holding a sword, charging into battle. If Ryam Redwyne is there, and there's going to be some Kingsguard there, and I would guess Ryam is very likely to have been one of them, he's got to be right beside him. And that's not very honorable to kill men in this situation. And if he was genuinely honorable for honor's sake or honorable for vanity's sake, well, think about Quentin's experience killing conscripts beneath the walls of Yunkai, and how horrible that was for him. Or what's it, Astapor? I don't remember which slaver city it was, but it doesn't matter. The point is the experience. He's traumatized by just killing people who basically couldn't fight back. And that's kind of the vibe we get from this event here, don't you think?
No, and I think that, but again, I think it's worth keeping in mind what is Ryam's personality here.
Yeah.
If he's someone who takes being a Kingsguard so incredibly seriously, and I think that he was, then it's very possible that he's also trying to sort of expiate these feelings, so to speak. He's also trying to wrestle with, Balon lost a brother, but I lost my prince. I lost my future king. So I have to make up for that as much as Balon has to make up for that. So it's very possible that Ryam also didn't want to give any quarter because he feels that loss and that shame and that hurt in his mind. And so he's going to take it out on the attackers here, that he's going to say, now all of you must be punished and must be punished violently because you have shamed me, because you have put me in this position where I've lost my prince and my future king.
And it's a very loud message as well that everyone hears. This Myrish bloodbath that's why it's called that, is recorded. And at the time, it must have really spread, the news of what happened. And so you know what happens if a Targaryen prince is killed. This might be what happens to you. You might not have had anything to do with it. But if someone in your army or your nationality does it, because, these were just Myrish sellswords, basically, or just men paid to do this invasion. Yeah, they didn't know what they were getting into with this. So, yeah, that might have been part of it. It might have been like, yeah, we have to make a loud response that people hear and fear us for again. They got lucky. We have to make sure they know that. We, every Friday, or rather we, meaning I, gather on Twitch with a lot of you all who hang out with me, and we play the game Crusader Kings 3, which is modded for A Song of Ice and Fire. It's extremely well detailed, and the way it basically works is we play a house, the lord or lady or king or queen, and you play their whole life. They have personality traits, battle skills, intrigue skills, or lack thereof. They might like traveling. They might be really religious. They might be gay. They might be a dwarf. They might be a genius. There's a variety of possibilities here, and some of these traits can run in the family. And when you die, your character, you take over as your heir. So you just keep playing as the next in line. And right now, as of this recording, we're playing House Osgrey during the time of the Century of Blood. So we also get to play in a variety of timelines, dragons or no dragons, current timeline, past. I definitely want to do a Redwyne playthrough sometime because the Arbor would be a very unique starting place, a spot that is hard to attack, but easy to perhaps attack from, and that could be fun. Never done that. Being in the extreme corner of the map would be interesting.
You know what the only contribution I ever made to one of your game streams was, and it's the only one because I could never do better than this. You're playing House Valerian, and so I decided that, and George Martin, in the unlikely event you're watching this, absolutely feel free to use this name. I decided that you had to name one of your characters Hilarion Valerian.
Oh, yeah. That is part of the fun. We have to have our pun names. Some houses are better than others for puns. Like,
how has he not named a character Hilarion Valerian?
He should have done that.
If you've got 3 brothers with R names for House Redwyne, how have you not named one Hilarion Valerian?
It's right there.
Come on, George.
We had so much fun with Manderley. It was, garbage Manderley, iron Manderley, magic Manderley, all that. Rain, of course, also just infinite puns
Oh,
with
I
House
remember
Rain.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
Rhymes too. You can do the rhyme. You can do punning rhymes, everything. Yeah. So it's a great time. Twitch.tv/History of Westeros every Friday at 6 Eastern. Lord Commander. A Song of Ice and Fire gives us a lot of perspective on this, almost literally, because we have two POVs from Lord Commanders, sort of. I mean, Barristan's no longer Lord Commander when he's got a POV, but he kind of is again as Dany's, but he doesn't really, there's not really a Kingsguard. He's still called a Queensguard. We'll count it. So, well,
retroactive.
Yeah, it works. It works. He's still, and Jaime, of course, is the other one. That's more straightforward. So while Barristan is the one compared to Ryam the most, it is Jaime who actually puts us in Ryam's boots, so to speak, holding the office he held, literally writing in the same white book, his Lannister posterior placed in the same seat, quote,
The chair behind the table was old black oak, with cushions of blanched cowhide, the leather worn thin. Worn by the bony arse of Barristan the Bold and Sir Gerald Hightower before him, by Prince Aemon the Dragonknight, Ser Ryam Redwyne, and the Demon of Derry, by Ser Duncan the Tall, and the Pale Griffin Alan Connington. How could the Kingslayer belong in such exalted company? Yet, here he was.
So it's reminiscent of the Bran quote, this list of famous knights. There's no, immortal characters like legendary heroes who may never have existed in this list. It's actual Kingsguard for sure, but it's still a wow list. And Jaime feels kind of unworthy. He calls them exalted. He's not idolizing or glorifying them like Bran did, but he still knows he's lesser. I mean, he knows he's right too.
Well, it sort of goes back to the Baelor episode, the last of the Baelor episodes, where Ryam Redwyne has and we'll get to this a little bit more in the Legacy, but by the time of the main novels, he's become this figure that you almost can't live up to, that no one can really equal because he has reached legendary status. Even though he didn't live that long ago, relatively speaking, in the history of Westeros, hey, there's the name. He didn't live that long ago, but he is a legend. He's someone that you can't really equal. You can only recognize that he was better than you.
Yeah, and that is Jaime in a nutshell in this scene. If she was younger Jaime, the Jaime of the past, the pre-maiming Jaime, he wouldn't have had this kind of reverence for the past, I don't think. He wouldn't have felt the weight of these long white shadows. I think he would have compared himself to them with a lot of cynicism. He would have instead of thinking of Ryam Redwyne as some great hero, he would have been like, yeah, that guy never had to deal with an Aerys. He lived in an easy time, and I could have beaten him, if it came to swords. So it would be easy for him to rationalize himself as superior, or at least not worse than, like, oh, he's not better than me. But this is a different Jaime. This is a much more humble Jaime. To be fair, young Jaime, very young Jaime, was in awe of Arthur Dayne and Blackfish, but it was of their deeds in war. It wasn't of their honorable nature or of their willingness to sacrifice. It was their skill with the sword. So yeah, it's a fair picture here, but it's not the total picture. Yeah, it's a golden age, but if it's so easy, why did no one else measure up to Ryam, right? This is the standard comeback. If it's that easy, then why didn't you do it? Or why did no one else do it? So that's a really important factor here as well. So I like the scene a lot, especially when we're able to compare it to other Kingsguard. But yes, he did become Lord Commander at some point. We don't know when. He may have been Lord Commander by the time of some of these prior events that we just discussed, though not before, say, was it the Fourth Dornish War, the year 83? Because it's 84 is the soonest he could have become Kingsguard, isn't that right? Or Lord Commander, isn't that right?
That's right. So yeah, at some point he was named Lord Commander. We don't get official dates on this, but worth pointing out, it's in the roughly last 2 decades of Jaehaerys' life and reign. So by this point, he's probably in his 40s. He's maybe in his early 50s. So this is not young teenage Ryam Redwyne who's first coming on to the scene. This is an older Ryam. This is an experienced Ryam. This is someone who has been at court, not just for the majority of his life, but also for a very long time, just generally speaking. And I think that there's a way in which he may have been viewed by this point as sort of the elder statesman of the Kingsguard, someone who had spent almost his entire adult life wearing a white cloak. If he wasn't the longest serving Kingsguard by this point, he probably was one of the longest. He was someone who had been around for several decades, who had seen a lot in the court of Jaehaerys I. And he's someone that Jaehaerys probably trusted quite a bit. Again, we talked about the family aspect of that, and that's certainly true. But also, at this time, by this time, Ryam has been by Jaehaerys' side quite literally for decades. There's no way that you don't have that sort of person serving you day after day, year after year, for decade upon decade, and not be close to them, literally speaking. Someone that you have to trust because that is what his role is. So I think in the same way that we talked about it was very natural for Jaehaerys to look to Ryam as a member of the Kingsguard, I think it may have felt very natural for Jaehaerys to then look to Ryam as his Lord Commander, as someone who could serve in this role as the Kingsguard because he had this long storied reputation behind him.
Yeah, it's very fitting, and you wonder if he was a legend by this point. You know, it's hard to pinpoint that in the real world. Like, when someone is legendary, at what point do they achieve that status? Is it one event that catapults them into that? Or is it a culmination of factors? It's somewhere in between. With Ryam, there is a candidate here for something that may have propelled him into that last stratosphere, to that highest point, just a little higher than he was, from super famous into legendary. I'm making up a scale here. Because of
the legendary scale.
Yeah, the legendary scale. Yeah, he's a 6.2. Yeah. But he's jumping. He's trying to get to 7. That's the highest. The 7 for Kingsguard. That's the highest.
There you go.
It's a 7-point scale. Yeah, 7-point scale. So the year 98, we had a really famous tournament, one of the most famous in Westerosi history. Tell us about that.
No, absolutely. So this is a good candidate for the single most famous tournament in the entire history of Westeros. Obviously, again, there's different opinions on this, but this is the 50th anniversary tourney. So this is the opportunity for Jaehaerys to celebrate being on the throne for 50 years, which is a really big deal, even for a modern monarch that is a very long reign. Mm-hmm. Not to mention someone who lives in a world where by your 60s, you're considered an old man. So Jaehaerys stages this tournament in 98 AC to celebrate being on the throne for 50 years. And Ryam is obviously competing. And so what happens is he wins against Clement Crab, but he doesn't just win in terms of tilt. They go against each other 30 times. They break 30 lances against each other before Jaehaerys declares them co-champions.
That is such a wild number. And the best we can do, because we've at times compared jousting to sports, that's one of our best ways to compare it, I think. We tried to come up with some ideas of what the comparison to 30 lance breakings in a tournament would be. What's the equivalent in, say, basketball? What do you think?
So context for this. I don't know a lot about sports. It may or may not surprise you to find that out. But someone who does know a lot about sports is my darling husband. So I had asked him, what makes the most sense? What is a good comparison here? Not to say, literally speaking. So obviously we don't have a direct comparison here in terms of what happened. But I was sort of getting in terms of sentiment. Like, what would be similar in terms of feeling? If you're a Westerosi watching this happen, what's a good modern day sports comparison? So I'm just going to read verbatim. I literally put this, what my husband said. And again, this is American basketball, so very specific reference here. But he had said Jordan's 6 3-pointers in Game 1 of the 1992 finals. The Spurs going approximately 18 for 20 in the first quarter of a 2014 finals game.
Whoa.
And LeBron James scoring around 45 against Detroit in 2007 to bring Cleveland to the finals. Again, wow. I'm not a sports expert. You may or may not agree with those. But I think that's a good way just for us to get kind of the sentiment here. to say what would have felt like in terms of seeing this happen.
That's a great point. Yeah, a great way to compare it. I think, like, if you all, by the way, listening, have ideas for what you would compare this to in a sport that you're familiar with or something besides sport, and while we're at it, go ahead and hit us up, drop a comment, send an email, what have you. Boxing comes to mind, like a really long boxing match, one that just maybe before the era where they had time limits and you just some 30 rounds. There might be some old time boxing match that went 30 rounds or something like that. I don't know. We'll have to look deeper into this one. But for now, in terms of opponent, this guy, Clement Crabbe, he stood toe-to-toe with Ryam Redwyne. What do we know about this guy?
Obviously, he's someone that Nimble Dick Crabbe in A Feast for Crows thinks is a big hero of his. Obviously, they're from the same family. We don't know very much about Clement's reputation as a Kingsguard, but I think it's probably fair to say that he was younger than Ryam. We certainly don't hear about him beforehand. We don't hear about him with Robin Shaw, joining the Kingsguard with Ryam Redwyne. So I think it's probably fair to say that he's younger, maybe even substantially younger. So this is even more impressive. Ryam is probably in his 60s at this point, and yet he is going not just well against Clement Crabbe, he's going spectacularly well. For point of comparison, Jaime Lannister and Jorah Mormont only break 9 lances against each other before Robert says, I'm going to give the victory to Jorah. Barristan thinks that Rhaegar did exceptionally well because he broke 12 lances against Arthur Dayne. Now imagine seeing double or triple that against someone, or by someone, who is considered old by Westerosi standards in a very dangerous sport. I think this would have been nothing short of amazing. Just the most amazing athletics you've ever seen.
Yeah, I agree. The crowd must have been unable to tell the story in a way that people wouldn't have thought they were exaggerating. It's one of those times where you don't have to exaggerate. Well, maybe this is an exaggeration, actually, but this is recorded by the Maester, so it probably is accurate. But it's the kind of story when you hear it, you'd be like, surely you're exaggerating, surely. Which is an example we get in the Hedge Knight, right? We have Dunk
with Sir Arlen. The story that Sir Arlen always tells is, well, I broke 7 lances against the Prince of Dragonstone, and that's pretty amazing. And
he's like,
Dunk says this, and
it was 5.
It's Baelor saying, look, but the thing is, Baelor says, look, it's nothing to sneeze at or to be ashamed of that you broke 4 lances against me. That's really good. Arlen is a little hedge knight from nowhere, and I'm a prince. I'm really good. So the fact that he still broke 4 lances, that's something to be proud of. Here we've got someone who is doing that 30 times.
So we acknowledge that it's an amazing feat to do at this age, but he might have been thinking about how this was the beginning of the twilight of his career. Of even he would have to slow down eventually. And
absolutely. And I think that, there's a way in which Ryam may have seen this as kind of his last hurrah. Whether or not he knew how long he was going to live, we know in reality he's got about 7 years left to live. He may not have known exactly how much time he had, but he certainly probably would have felt that he was older. Again, 60s is considered an old age in Westeros. Not to say people can't live longer than that. Obviously, someone like Walder Frey has lived long past that. But for someone like Ryam Redwyne, he may have felt, this is sort of it. I don't have much longer to go. So let me go out with a bang. Let me go out with a blaze of glory. I'm going to do my best possible job because this is probably going to be my last big tournament. This is my last hurrah. This is my last great showing. Let me go off on a high note rather than sort of fall into obscurity.
There was one more chapter of his career here that was less about being a knight, but in ways was still about being a knight because he did this job like a knight, and it's a job that you shouldn't do like a knight. And that is Hand of the King. His fame wasn't quite complete. His legend wasn't quite complete. Neither was his story, most of all. He had one big thing left. After the tournament, only 2 weeks later, Septon Barth died. And King Jaehaerys immediately turned to Ser Ryam to be his new hand. He's an older man. They had been around each other a long time. The idea of a Kingsguard, well, Lord Commander being hand isn't new to us as readers of the books. We've seen several examples of it. But this was 200 years prior to the books, and it was new then.
It is an interesting question as to why Jaehaerys turned to Ryam, of all people, to serve as his hand. We don't hear about Ryam holding any other post in Jaehaerys' government other than a Kingsguard and then eventually Lord Commander. It's not like he was in a semi-political or openly political or diplomatic role before he's suddenly elevated to the highest office that anyone who's not the king can have in Westeros. It's also interesting because Jaehaerys doesn't look to his son Balon, even though Balon is about 40. He's obviously Jaehaerys' preferred heir. So it's a little strange that he would look to Ryam and not someone that is going to take over for him. Now, to be fair, maybe he's thinking, well, the last time there was a Targaryen who named another Targaryen hand, it was my father Aenys who named Maegor, and that went very poorly. It's also possible that Jaehaerys didn't want to be reminded that his own time was probably not very long. Balon is obviously of a younger generation than the king himself. So if he names Balon, it's not that Balon is an incredibly young man, but he's young for Jaehaerys, and that might have made the king feel that his end was even sooner, that he's not so much appointing a new hand as he is almost giving up some of his authority, almost stepping back a step from the role as king.
Yeah, I mean, this is a man who had definitely proven his loyalty. 4 decades on the Kingsguard, but also his family's service before that counts among Westerosi. The recent deeds of House Redwyne kind of all count for all the members of it. That's the kind of the way Westeros works. So it's a lot that was going for him, but that isn't necessarily enough, right? That doesn't mean you're going to be a good hand to the king. It's an entirely different job. So what was Jaehaerys thinking? Did he just not perceive the issue here properly? Maybe he just misread the situation, or maybe he was just overvaluing other qualities that Ryam had. What do we think?
I think there may have been several factors going into it, and maybe sort of a perfect storm of sorts of factors going into the choice of Ryam. Number one, again, we've said this several times, and it's worth repeating. Ryam had been at court basically from the moment Jaehaerys started to rule in his own right, and he's probably by this time one of the few people left at court who can remember young Jaehaerys, who can remember teenager, young adult Jaehaerys. And I think Jaehaerys may have set a store by that. This is someone that has known him for a very long time. It's an obvious point, but worth repeating, that the role of the Kingsguard is to be around the king and the royal family 24/7. So you're with the king at his most intimate moments. You're with the king every single hour of every single day. There's no way for Ryam not to learn about Jaehaerys the person as much as Jaehaerys the monarch over the course of, almost 40 years on the Kingsguard by the time he's being named hand of the king. So maybe Jaehaerys is thinking, this is someone I can trust. This is someone who knows me. This is someone who can maybe be like that Barth. Someone like my friend Barth, who gets me, who can sort of read my mind and knows what I want to happen and can make it happen. And I think that Jaehaerys may have also felt Ryam's seen a lot. He's not just seen the Lucamore Strong incident. He's also seen, the Visera incident. He's seen the Visera incident. He's seen all this, and he's not turned away from the royal family. He's not conspired against the royal family. He's remained devotedly loyal. So maybe Jaehaerys is thinking, this is who I need. This is someone who has seen it all with House Targaryen, has been with us for years and years and years. He has this stellar reputation as a knight. This is somebody I can trust to help me do my job.
And his popularity probably mattered a bit here too, right? That might be something Jaehaerys overvalued or thought would lend more credibility to the office. Maybe he thought a lot of the decisions would still come from him, or maybe he just thought Ryam would be a better decision maker. Either way, that seems to be a big factor, his popularity. Wouldn't you agree?
I do. I think that, it's not like Jaehaerys was just thinking, oh, who's the best jouster? Yep, they're going to be a good hand, so I should pick Ryam Redwyne. But I think it's more going to Ryam being seen as a model of chivalry. He's a model of, the quote-unquote, the perfect knight, this hero of chivalry that can be trusted. And so maybe Jaehaerys is thinking, well, he's got the love of the people. Everyone likes him. He's been around for a long time. So, of course he's going to be a capable leader because he's got this base of popularity, but he's not himself got personal ambition. He's got nothing to work for because, well, he's a Kingsguard. So he has no lands or fortunes or family that he's going to be able to promote in this office. So maybe Jaehaerys is thinking he's kind of the best of all worlds. He's officially neutral, but he knows me so well.
Yeah, I can see that. Absolutely. Unhand of the king. Whatever the reason that Jaehaerys chose Ryam to be hand, it would be a short-lived tenure. It didn't last very long at all. Tell us what happened there.
Yeah, so, literally, it's barely a year in office, and Jaehaerys, Ryam doesn't quit, Jaehaerys removes him, and in fact puts in Prince Baelon, as he might have done, but like we talked about, didn't when he first named Ryam. Here's a really curious thing, and it was one of the frustrating aspects for me of Fire and Blood. We get no details as to why Ryam Redwyne is such a bad hand. He's just told that he's bad. The most that we can get is Grand Maester Allar's review of him, which is to say, some problems could not be solved by hitting them with a stick. But we don't know what that means practically. What did Ryam Redwyne do as hand that made the Grand Maester have that opinion of him? Unfortunately, we just really don't know.
It sounds like he walked around hitting things with sticks. That would get you removed from office quickly. Like, what happened to this guy? He seems to have lost it.
He took the Teddy Roosevelt advice, but he just literally carried a big stick.
Yeah, he just whacked people. Council meetings are like, well, I'm not sure if we can accomplish whack. Like, I'd like to challenge you. Whack! Yeah, so the king's like, we can't do business like that. It seriously, though, it does kind of imply a lack of subtlety, a man who maybe doesn't understand nuance. Maybe he was rigid. If the Lucamore, the Lusty situation is any example, maybe he just couldn't bend like a Stannis. Like, politics requires flexibility, and maybe he wasn't. And that can be good for a Kingsguard, but it's not good for this office, so... Yeah. So what happened next?
So I, start thinking what could have happened. Obviously, we don't have details of what he was exactly doing wrong, but I think there's a few factors to Ryam Redwyne that may hint at what was going on or what he was doing wrong. The office of Hand of the King is not an easy office. You are king in all but name. You are there to rule literally in the king's name. You are the first executive officer after the king. You are there to make sure that what the king wants gets done. It's not an easy role, even for highborn Westerosi aristocrats trained for political leadership. Think of Ned. Ned is a very capable Lord of Winterfell. Ned is not doing anything wrong as Lord of Winterfell, but he fails as Hand of the King in almost every way, some notable exceptions, but he fails because he fundamentally misunderstands the office. It's not because he's stupid or he's a bad lord. He just doesn't get what it means to be Hand of the King in most of what he does. And now think of someone like Ryam Redwyne. He's coming into this office with way less experience than Ned. At the very least, no, Ned is not raised to rule, but he is raised to be his brother's right-hand man. He is getting a political education right alongside Robert from Jon Arryn. Ryam, he's probably not getting that. Again, we mentioned this. He's the third son. He's not the heir and he's not the spare. So there's no universe, probably, in which he's being raised to have much of a political role. And even if he had, even whatever education he may have had as a young man, as a young scion of House Redwyne, he's been in the Kingsguard since he was maybe in his early 20s. So he's been dedicating himself to this role as royal guard much longer than he's had any kind of formal education or training. The job of the Kingsguard, and I've said this many times in this episode, and I'm going to keep saying it, the fundamental job of the Kingsguard is to defend the king, to obey the king, to serve the king, and to die for the king. The job of the Kingsguard is not, at least in the job description, to get a political education, to serve as the king's counselor, to be one of his officers of state. For better or worse, your job is to obey and die, not to think. And so the same qualifications, I think, that may have made Ryam so natural, so as a choice as a Kingsguard, so neutral, so independent of factionalism, may have made him a very unsavvy individual, someone who's not really aware of how he needs to operate as hand.
Yeah, it's a good theory. It's definitely the way I lean there. I like your point about Ned just fundamentally misunderstanding the way Hand of the King works and what it's supposed to be. And that fits really well here, too. I wonder if Jaehaerys maybe didn't think, well, he's observed the office of Hand of the King for so long. Maybe some of it rubbed off on him, but yeah, it didn't.
No, I mean, you can compare him maybe to someone like Hota. You know, the popular joke in the fandom is to call him the camera that rides, and I do think there's more interesting aspects to him, but fundamentally, what is Ario's creed to himself? It's to serve, protect, obey. That's what he thinks he should be doing. It's not to think for Doran. It's not to advise Doran what to do. It's not to say, well, actually, I read over these memos, and here's where I think, here's my analysis of it. It's serve, protect, obey. That's what Ryam is also being raised to do as a Kingsguard.
Hota was like a sixth son, wasn't he? Some absurd number really up there. Yeah, that's a good comparison, though. And the royal family was different at this point. Like when we started this episode, or when Jaehaerys became king, basically this is the era where Ryam was coming up. That's when he was a squire. Now, there's been scandals. There's been Alysanne has passed. A lot of the children are gone. A lot of them are dead. It's just a different realm at this point. Jaehaerys has lost Septon Barth. His health is down. So we should maybe reconsider that this is not the same realm anymore. This is not the same royal family. It's a lot different.
No, it's not. I mean, Jaehaerys will be bedridden for the last years of his life. We don't know if that started at this point. We don't know the exact moment where that started. But I think it's probably fair to say that he was at least in declining health by this time. So it's very possible that he may have anticipated relying more on Ryam. Not in a selfish way that we see with Robert in the main novels, where he says, well, I'm going to go off and do whatever I want, and you can figure out the office for me. But more in the way of, I physically can't. I don't have the energy anymore. I don't have the capability anymore. You've got to take over because I simply can't. And so on top of the pressure of understanding the office of Hand of the King, there may have been this added pressure to perform as king in all but name. And again, we're talking about someone who's not raised to do this. He's not being educated to do this. And nor is he himself young. Again, he's not ancient by Westerosi standards, but he's certainly old by Westerosi standards. So he himself is not the young, vigorous man he once was.
Yeah, it's a bit old for a career change, you could say. It's a very interesting perspective because even though we have limited information on what made him an ineffective hand, we have a lot of examples of hands of the king, hands of the queen. We just talked about Ned Stark. Tyrion is acting hand for a while. We have Davos, who we'll mention in a minute again. I'm forgetting some others, but the most obvious is Barristan Selmy in A Dance with Dragons, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, they are very direct parallels, not only because they're probably of an age. In other words, Ryam is probably about the age Barristan is in the main novels and in Dance with Dragons. But also, once Dany flies off on Drogon and Hisdar is deposed by Barristan, Barristan appoints himself Hand of the Queen. But he's not doing it because he's always been super ambitious and now I get to have all the political power to myself. No, in fact, he thinks to himself, I am no hand. I am only a simple knight, the queen's protector. I never wanted this. He appoints himself hand because, as he fully admits, there's no one else for the job. No one else can do that role except him. He's the last one left, so to speak. Now, granted, he has a little bit of advantage that Ryam probably didn't, in that he's got Missandei, who is very clever and is able to advise him. And his rule is probably not going to be very long, and it's certainly going to be dominated by the one thing Barristan can do very well, which is war. He's going to go out and fight against the Yunkai. So, in a strange way, the fact that there's so much peace in Jaehaerys' reign is actually a bit of a drawback for Ryam Redwyne, because he can't do the one thing that he may have been capable of doing, which is leading men in war.
That's true. Now, unless he just outright embarrassed himself in a very public way, maybe they were able to just slide out of this situation because the role was handed over to Prince Balon, and that's not shameful to have the heir to the throne, which he was by that time, named in your place. I mean, that's the one person that's above you rank-wise, basically. So it's a good way for him to be like, yeah, there's no pride issue here or minimal pride issue. He's older. There's a lot of, it's a stepping down, right? They can paint it in a way that's not so bad. He wasn't actively ambitious. He wasn't forced out by political, machinations. It's just, he's back. He gets to go back home where he was home. He's already home. Red Keep has been his home for how long now? 50 years. So
Decades.
he gets to just kind of retire in the role that he's supposed to retire in.
Yeah, I think of it as sort of like almost a nicer way of what Cersei tried to do with Barristan in the Game of Thrones, where she says, well, you're older and you've served a very long time and it's been very honorable and we've loved having you. Now we're going to have you retire. Now, obviously, that does not fly with Barristan because you don't retire from the Kingsguard. You serve for life. You die when the king dies or the Seven decide you die. This is a little bit easier, though, because you can have a hand resign, and it's not considered a shameful act or a crazy act to witness. So I think maybe it may have been something along the lines of, well, Ryam, you've served very well, even though we all know you haven't. And we all respect what you've done, and you're such an institution, and we've really appreciated you having you. But we know that you're older, and we want you to be able to serve out your years in the honorable position that you've always had. And I think everyone would have been fine with that.
Last years, Ryam actually outlived Jaehaerys. He died in 103, and that would be yet another just big milestone, something he lived through. He's an older man, and he's seen the entirety of Jaehaerys' career, basically. And that's, as we talked about, the longest reign any king had, or will have. And I don't know if Ryam realized that at the time, probably considered that this would be hard to top. In general, it would be a big deal. How would he have felt, you think? Not just personally, but professionally.
I mean, I think it would have been pretty devastating for him. We talked about before this idea of the Kingsguard, and specifically embodied in Barristan, of the sadness and shame and feeling of failure for a Kingsguard to outlive his king. Again, there's nothing that Ryam practically could have done to stop Jaehaerys from dying. Jaehaerys is 69 years old and in bad health at the end of his life. There's not anything Ryam can do to save him from dying a natural death, but he's still going to feel that. He's still going to think, why am I alive and the king is dead? I should have died for the king. I should not be alive if the king is not alive. And again, he's not just watched the king die, he's also watched two potential kings die. He's seen Aemon die, maybe even in front of his eyes if he was on Tarth. And he's also seen Balon die. Again, maybe in front of his eyes because Balon died in the Red Keep. So I think there's this way in which Ryam may have been thinking, I've seen so many kings or would-be kings pass, and why am I left? Why am I the last survivor? Why am I still here? And all of these royals who should be reigning are not reigning.
You wonder if he wanted one last hurrah, one that he could have a real fight in, and maybe that would be where he fell at last, and that would be good for his legend, perhaps. But he did become Lord Commander for the new king, Viserys I. And this is interesting because we talk about how the Kingsguard have a lot of interactions with the princes, but Viserys would have been a younger generation and not particularly martial as far as the Targaryen princelings go. So he might have had a much different connection to Viserys, not a close one at all, which would have been a huge contrast from Jaehaerys.
If we talked at the beginning of the young Ryam watching this early adult Jaehaerys literally training with his Kingsguard, getting so good that his Kingsguard thinks he even could have beaten Maegor in a fight. And now he's watching not just this much younger man ascend, but someone who has no interest in jousting or swordplay. It's possible, I think, that Ryam is maybe a little disappointed, maybe even in a way that he wouldn't necessarily admit, but thinking, Aemon and Balon, who were these brave fighters who were both in war, who were both willing to go to war, why are they dead and Viserys is the king now? How does that make sense? That why are these sort of paragons of princely chivalry dead, and now we've got a king on the Iron Throne who quite simply doesn't care, who doesn't want to be grand and martial in the way that I understand? How does that make sense?
Well, one thing they might have agreed on is Viserys really liked tournaments. So that's one little tidbit that might have worked out well for them as in their relationship. It's unclear whether Ryam went to this maiden pool tournament in 104 to celebrate the new king's ascension. Viserys is sort of, I'm the king now tournament. He probably would have been there, though, right? It's likely.
I think so. Whether or not he would have been competing, I don't know. I don't think he would have necessarily been too old. Again, if we're thinking that he's roughly of an age with Barristan is definitely still a formidable fighter in the main novel. So I don't think that Ryam was necessarily incapable of doing it. But he also may have thought, well, I did so well in the anniversary tournament that anything I do after this is almost an insult to that. It's almost this, horrible denouement. But I would love to imagine that he did, because this may have been the one and only time that he interacted with Criston Cole. Criston Cole makes a name for himself at this tournament. This is really where he comes onto the scene as a famous knight. So it's very interesting to speculate, did Ryam Redwyne interact with Criston at all? This sort of almost passing of the torch in a way, or may have seemed like that later, that the older knight of the older generation is now interacting with the younger knight who is, no spoilers, about to take his place.
Yeah, in a lot of things too, right? The best knight in terms of martial skill, eventual Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and also Hand of the King. Like this, yeah. I didn't mention him earlier when we mentioned people that were Hand. He's a good example, of course. I was only mentioning POV characters before, but Criston Cole is an example of a Hand of the King that is a big parallel here. Last of the Redwyne. In 105 AC, he finally passed. Do we have many details there?
It's not even a full sentence. It's just part of a sentence that Ryam Redwyne died. I don't think there's any suggestion that there was foul play here or any sort of violence. I think it's simply the fact that in Westeros, you are considered old in your mid-60s. Obviously, we don't consider that. But in Westeros, you are considered old in your mid-60s. And this is a pseudo-medieval world, so it may not have taken much if there's a sudden illness, if there's a broken hip, if there's whatever it may have been that just sort of carries Ryam off. And I don't think it would have surprised anyone that this guy who was in his mid-60s is, finally passing away.
Yeah, his death must have seemed like the end of an era in itself. A living legend transitioning to, well, regular legend, I suppose.
He doesn't need the qualifier anymore.
Yeah, just legend. Regular legend, yeah.
Well, and I agree. I think you're right, because we mentioned this a bit with respect to Jaehaerys naming him his hand, but by the time he dies, Ryam is probably one of the few courtiers who remembered the early days of Jaehaerys' reign. If anyone at court wants stories about what young Jaehaerys was like, what this sort of golden age, or supposed golden age of Westeros was like under young King Jaehaerys, Ryam is the person to tell those stories. Ryam is the one who remembers. And by the time of his death, I don't think there's any doubt he's the most famous Kingsguard who, not just of his time, but of any time. This is the first century of Targaryen rule has passed, and no one exceeds Ryam Redwyne in terms of fame as members of the Kingsguard. And in fact, he may have been the first Kingsguard to really become a sort of celebrity, someone who is celebrated, someone who is very widely remembered. It's not to say that, again, we mentioned at the top, Gildain certainly thinks of Jaehaerys' first Kingsguard as very illustrious, and we know the names of other Kingsguard, but Ryam Redwyne is standing out himself. He is someone who, again, continues to be remembered even into the modern age of the main novel. So this may have been one of the first times that a Kingsguard knight transitions into that celebrity status, into that legendary status. I could see a lot of people at court when he dies saying, well, we'll never see his like again, or there goes the end of an era, or there goes a legend. But, these sort of sentiments of when a famous person passes away, when a very famous, especially an older famous person passes away, well, that's the end of the era. That's where if the book has finally closed on Jaehaerys' era.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, too, because it's not just his own era, which by itself is an important thing, but because, as you said, he is unique in so many ways, and he almost created a template for future instances to be recognized. Like he is the category that other people are now occasionally added to. And there's a certain gravitas and extra legend status attached to being the first one to do certain things. And yeah, like you said, being attached to Jaehaerys, that's a huge one because that's the Golden Age and he is the last real piece of that. And yeah, you're right about the stories. He should have had his own podcast. That would have been a good podcast. Or maybe he's bad at that too. He's just like, no, it's the same reason I'm a bad hand to the king. I'm not a good talker. So we don't know where he was buried, right? That's kind of interesting, right? In general, we don't know Kingsguard burial practices because they can't just all go back to their house. Some of them don't have a house, right? Like where was Sir Duncan buried?
I'm so intrigued by that. I mean, granted, is there anything left of Dunk? Because I don't know what may have remained if he was burned. But also, no, this is a very minor point that I don't necessarily expect the author to ever get into, but I am fascinated by, which is, do Kingsguard go back to their homes or do they get interred with the Targaryens? Because theoretically, they are giving up their identities to join the Kingsguard. They are supposed to be totally devoted to House Targaryen. So there is a way in which maybe they're buried with the Targaryens. Maybe they are interred with the Targaryens they serve as a reminder that these people are eternally connected to us. Or maybe if they do have a home, their bones do go back there. I would love to know the answer to this, and I don't think we ever will, but I'm very intrigued.
I like that first idea that they are eternally guarding the royal family that they guarded in life. That's really nice. And there is a chance we learn that if they, maybe I'm optimistic. They could go down. They could go down and lower in Dragonstone and maybe see that as or
the
something.
Thing is, I do have a vision in mind, and I don't necessarily know that this will happen, but I would love it to happen. I have a vision in mind that when Daenerys comes back to Westeros, obviously she's going to land on Dragonstone first. That just makes the most sense physically, I think, and logistically. But I think she's going to have this moment kind of similar to Bran in the Winterfell Crypts, where he's sort of identifying all of these past Starks. I kind of imagine that Daenerys, who has never known any of her family except Viserys, will go into the Crypts on Dragonstone and kind of walk through and have, and there is Jaehaerys, and there is Alysanne, and there is Daeron the Good, and there is, whoever else it may be. So maybe we'll see. Oh, and by the way, there are the bones or the ashes of Ryam Redwyne, and there are the bones or ashes of the White Bull, or, whoever it may be.
Yeah, the Starks have a direwolf by them, the kings. The one, why not some Kingsguard by the Targaryens? Legacy. We talked about how his brief tenure as Hand probably didn't harm his reputation too much. He had so much built up goodwill and legendary status, glory, etc., especially among other Kingsguard. He didn't fail at that. The Kingsguard could look up to him still because he never failed at that job, right? It was like, well, who cares if he was bad as a hand? I don't look up to that anyway. I'm trying to be a knight, and he's the perfect example of that. So let's consider who was next. The following Lord Commander was probably Sir Harold Westerling, but there was a little bit of time between. There could have been somebody else. Sir Harold only died 7 years after Ser Ryam, so he wouldn't have been Lord Commander for very long, but he lived in Ryam's shadow. And as the first guy to be Lord Commander after Ryam, big boots to fill there.
Oh, 100%. I mean, those are some huge sabatons, so to speak, in terms of filling that. But even more so, Criston Cole, I think, is a huge figure to talk about here, because quite literally, he is stepping into Ryam Redwyne's shoes. He is the person who was appointed after Ryam Redwyne dies to take his place. And I have to imagine that had a deep emotional and psychological impact on that, especially, and this is somewhat headcanon, but I do like to think this, to what extent did Criston feel unworthy, or was he made to feel unworthy specifically because he was succeeding Ser Ryam? After all, Ryam is not just the bluest of the blue blood aristocrats. He's been on the Kingsguard for decades by the time of his death. He is a legend in his own right. He is a legendary figure. And who's Criston Cole? He's 23? He's the son of a steward? He's a nobody from nowhere, relatively speaking, at least. And so I think there's a way in which either Criston himself and or courtiers around him were thinking, who's this guy? He doesn't deserve to be here. He doesn't deserve to be where Ryam Redwyne sat. He doesn't deserve to wear the cloak that Ryam Redwyne wore. Who is this nobody from nowhere who presumes to take his place? So, does that influence him? I have to think it does. And maybe, like Ryam, maybe Criston Cole thinks, I'm going to be the most Kingsguard of all Kingsguard. I'm going to take this role so incredibly seriously that no one can doubt that I deserve to be here, that I deserve to be the successor of Ryam Redwyne, that I deserve to sit where he sat and wear the cloak that he wore. And obviously, that may have come into play because, like Ryam Redwyne, who's confronting this sort of sexual scandal with Lucamore Strong, there is, whatever may have actually happened, this sexual relationship or sexual scandal with Rhaenyra. So how is that impacting him? Is Criston, is he taking Ryam Redwyne as his model and saying, no, I can't be part of this. In fact, I'm going to take this so seriously that I'm going to turn against you forever because I can't countenance any of this, just like Ryam Redwyne couldn't countenance Lucamore Strong having multiple quote-unquote wives.
And as Hand, Criston had a longer tenure, not much longer, but maybe a few months longer. He wouldn't be remembered any better than Ryam was. In fact, he'd be remembered quite a bit worse. He's infamous for his time in the office. But there's still a comparison to be made here, which is that when Aegon II named Criston his hand, he's like, my hand is a steel fist. That's a little bit similar to the hitting things, solving problems with a stick comment. Like, my new hand is a stick. My new hand holds a stick. It's similar to my new hand is a steel fist. So, yeah, I don't suppose they were that similar people, maybe, but they could have been. This part seems very similar, though, along with the quality of their skill at arms. That certainly would have been similar. So in the 2 centuries following Ryam's death, this legacy is absolutely carried forward. He's the byword for knightly honor and Kingsguard prestige. He's kind of the model. He's kind of like the aspirational figure.
He's the dictionary definition. You open the Westerosi dictionary, you go to Kingsguard, there's his picture. He's right there. Yeah. This is, again, we started the episode with that quote from Bran. He's the figure you can easily name. If someone says, name a famous Kingsguard, first answer on the board is gonna be Ryam Redwyne. And we see this with, Jon's memories of him sparring with Robb when they're boys, and they're calling out these famous heroes and these legendary figures. One of them is Ryam Redwyne. They're thinking of this even as Northern boys because he is so famous, because he is so well known as a knight. Even someone like Dunk is familiar with Ryam Redwyne. He's not an aristocrat. He doesn't grow up with aristocrats, but he knows the songs and stories of Ryam Redwyne. He hears about them. This popularity and this celebrity status, this legendary status of Ryam Redwyne has trickled down from the aristocracy in the highest echelon of Westerosi society all the way down to someone like Dunk. Everyone knows Ryam Redwyne.
Yeah, every single one. It's ubiquitous. He's ubiquitous. Songs praising his chivalry are mentioned in A Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, and A Storm of Swords. Pretty good chance we haven't heard the last of him. Here's a comparison to Barristan and Aemon the Dragonknight. It comes when Ned expects the Kingsguard to help Robert. What a notion, right? The Kingsguard actually protect the king. Quote, the Kingsguard...
A paper shield, the eunuch said. Try not to look so shocked, Lord Stark. Jaime Lannister is himself a sworn brother of the White Swords, and we all know what his oath is worth. The days when men like Ryam Redwyne and Prince Aemon the Dragonknight wore the white cloak are gone to dust and song.
So Ryam was probably a huge influence on Loras in particular, one would think, and we know that this happened because, well, we'll tell you here. Like Ryam, Loras was the third son. Loras even has Redwyne blood. Olenna is a Redwyne, the Queen of Thorns. Loras' paternal aunt, Mina Tyrell, was also married to Lord Paxter Redwyne, so they're deeply connected. And his maternal aunt, Denise Hightower, married to Sir Desmond Redwyne. That's wild, right? So take it away here. There's so much going on here, and it ends with a very unlikely figure getting involved.
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I cannot imagine. We're not in Loris's head as a POV, but if we were, I would be shocked if he did not mention Ryam Redwyne as someone who had a huge influence on him growing up. I can imagine young Loris growing up on the Arbor. He probably literally thought of himself as a new Ryam Redwyne. He can see the parallels so easily. As he's growing up in Highgarden, not the Arbor. Although he may have visited the Arbor because
Probably.
of those familial connections. But he's thinking, I'm another third son. I'm really talented at jousting. I've got those aristocratic credentials. And even though he's not necessarily dreaming of being in the Kingsguard as a young boy, maybe he is. And maybe he's thinking, I could be another Kingsguard the way that Ryam was. I could be a celebrity knight the way that Ryam was. I can dream of wearing that white cloak because I have that example in front of me of someone almost exactly in my position who had this glorious career as a Kingsguard knight. And we see, and we mentioned this at the beginning, Loris is precociously talented in the way that Ryam Redwyne appears to have been as well. He's not just performing, but winning tournaments. When he's 16 years old, he's already knighted. He is no slouch when it comes to the joust and to martial swordplay. In fact, he only really loses the melee at Bitterbridge because Brienne pulled a dunk-like move and uses her physical strength and stature to beat him. He's not losing because he's bad at arms or because he can't perform chivalry. He's better than virtually everyone else there. So I think that he really may have seen himself and may continue to see himself as a Ryam Redwyne-like figure.
And other people would be there to point that out too. If he didn't notice it himself, there'd be eagerness in his own family to see someone of that talent achieve similar status or even a shred of that status. That would be great for the Tyrells, great for the Redwynes. But an unlikely man here helped push things along. Who's that?
It's Littlefinger.
Littlefinger pays singers in the Tyrell camp to tell the legend of Ryam Redwyne in order to indirectly convince Loris to join the Kingsguard. This is all during the time where they're trying to arrange the marriage to the Lannisters. Littlefinger goes off with all his new titles of his own and lots of money to bribe people, and Tyrion wondering what his angle is. Well, of course, it ends up being poisoning Joffrey and among other things, but that's another story. Loris, this is so straightforward because he's so obvious as a candidate to be like this. And well, Ryam didn't have a sister become queen like Marjorie did, Loris' sister becoming queen, but he obviously lived at court. His family was at court all the time. So here's the actual incident. It's great. I love this moment. So let's hear it. Littlefinger name dropping Ryam and some other of the usual suspects. Quote,
I also planted the notion of Ser Loris taking the white. Not that I suggested it. That would have been too crude. But men in my party supplied grisly tales about how the mob had killed Ser Preston Greenfield and raped the Lady Lollies, and slipped a few silvers to Lord Tyrell's army of singers, to sing of Ryam Redwyne, Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, and Prince Aemon the Dragonknight. A harp can be as dangerous as a sword, in the right hands. Mace Tyrell actually thought it was his own idea to make Ser Loris's inclusion in the Kingsguard part of the marriage contract. Who better to protect his daughter than her splendid knightly brother? And it relieved him of the difficult task of trying to find lands and a bride for a third son. Never easy, and doubly difficult in Ser Loris's case.
it's a great example of several of the points we've made. The role of a third son, Loris, a Tyrell of Highgarden, influenced by stories that he would have grown up with and are built of a person that he's related to. He's the most effective of the names listed there. He's not going to be like Serwyn of the Mirror Shield. We don't even really know what that guy was like. That's some man who may not even have existed. If he did, it was thousands of years ago. And Prince Aemon was a Targaryen. He's obviously going to connect himself with his grandmother's house over the Targaryen here. So, and Mace, the quote about Mace thinking it was his idea, that's just Well, that's just Littlefinger for you. A Littlefinger understanding how people will work. And this is how a legend can be used as a weapon. And that's really that's a little unusual. It's a great way to think about it, and an interesting play by George to have the world building, to have the legendary used by a master of intrigue to push his plots forward. It's really interesting, I think.
No, agreed. And you know, that makes me think of as well, when you say sort of a legend as a weapon, it's also a little bit, not as a negative weapon, but also a bit used by Sansa at the beginning of A Clash of Kings. Because what does she do when Dantos is coming out and Joffrey's like, we should kill him? What does she do? Well, she reaches to the tropes of chivalry, and she said, it's actually considered bad luck to kill someone. So what you really should be doing is making him your fool. She's also using sort of legend and stories and tropes to save a man's life, because she's trying to manipulate Joffrey into saving a man's life. So indirectly, she is using that idea of the chivalric saving of the innocent to save Dantos' life, kind of in the way that Barristan did.
And then it goes forward with Dantos manipulating Sansa, knowing exactly what to say, probably because he was coached by Littlefinger. Daddy came up with all this on his own, but still, here it is, quote,
"Your Lord Father was as true a man as the realm has ever known, but I stood by and let them slay him. I said nothing, did nothing, and yet, when Joffrey would have slain me, you spoke up. Lady, I have never been a hero, no Ryam Redwyne or Barristan the Bold. I've won no tourneys, no renown in war. But I was a knight once, and you have helped me remember what that meant. My life is a poor thing, but it is yours."
So again, he mentions Ryam Redwyne and Barristan the Bold, and Littlefinger knows that Sansa's got her head in the stories, and so he mentions the current legend and the one most like him from the songs and stories, and it's a hook. Sansa wants to believe it, even though she's starting to have suspicions. She wants to believe it. She perceives this as an oath, and that's a big deal too. He suggests she calls him my Florian, and she does. So she's just getting more and more bought in and using the thing that's the closest to her heart, these songs and stories. And it's another example of this being used as a weapon. Still probably Littlefinger doing it, but but this is at an interesting time for her because, right, this is when she's losing some of her naivete, right? Like I said, but like not quite there, and this starts to pull her back, right?
Well, and it is. And then, I always like to point out, it's not to say that Sansa stops believing in songs and stories and thinks they're all dumb or right. You can't believe that. Because, in fact, this is also the era in which Sansa is using the stories of Aemon and Daenerys to challenge Joffrey. When they see Myrcella off and, Tommen is weeping and Joffrey makes fun of him, Sansa points out, by the way, the stories say that Aemon wept when Daenerys was married, so, it's okay for a prince to weep. So she's also aware of how to use these stories and these legends to combat what she's also seeing as an injustice. So it's not to say that she stops believing in songs and stories, and she'll use them in a very nice way, in a very kind-hearted way with Robert Arryn in A Feast for Crows when they're coming down the mountain. But I think it is a way that, to this point specifically with Ryam Redwyne, Dantos is, and Littlefinger via Dantos, is trying to manipulate Sansa directly. And he's trying to make sure that she will do what he wants. And so he is playing on that idea of the great knightly savior. In all the stories and the songs, the maiden is saved by a great knight. And who's the greatest knight in relatively recent Westerosi legend? Well, it's Ryam Redwyne. This is a figure that Sansa can believe in will save her because that's who should be saving her, according to these stories.
Yeah, and it might have crossed her mind that Ryam deserved much of what was said about him, but later when the songs and stories, when she starts to have a more mature view of it, she might start to realize that some of that legend was probably exaggerated a bit. After all, in that sentence, Dantos mentioned Ryam Redwyne and Barristan the Bold. What did Sansa observe Barristan's fate to be? Laughed out of the Red Keep and his forced retirement scene, she thought about that, and she was like, boy, that must have really hurt. She thought that his sworn brothers laughed. She perceived it very well. It was very moving. The way she had empathy for him and how perceptive she was about what would have hurt there. And then come back to Joffrey a minute later and, the exact opposite here. So, of course, this isn't meant to take anything away from Ryan or Barristan. This is George's world, and George doesn't write perfect people. Perfection exists only in songs and stories, which is why throughout this episode, we've been questioning some of the greatness. We don't have certainty. Maybe he really was that great, but it makes sense that some of this is exaggerated. Quote,
"She shouted for Ser Dantos, for her brothers, for her dead father and her dead wolf, for gallant Ser Loras, who had given her a red rose once. But none of them came. She called for the heroes from the songs, for Florian and Ser Ryam Redwyne and Prince Aemon the Dragonknight, but no one heard."
Along with the earlier mentions of Robb and Jon, Sansa's chapters remind us that heroism and stories can span cultural barriers, especially in Westeros. North and South, there's a lot of back and forth there. Less the other one way than the other. There's a lot more Southern heroes mentioned in the North than the other way around. Like they're not talking about Craig and Stark or, Brandon the Builder up and down in the South that much. At least not in terms of I want to be like them. So, and of course, amongst the Ironborn, no one's talking about being Ironborn except the Ironborn, right? Like, imagine some Reach lady going, why is our son calling himself Dagon Drum, the Reaver and Necromancer? That's odd. Why isn't he wanting to be like Ryam Redwyne? Do you think any Ironborn knights, because there's a few. Do you think any of them care about Ryam Redwyne? Or?
Honestly, I would be intrigued. Obviously, there are some, like Harris Harlaw, so I could imagine where he may have thought of Ryam Redwyne as someone. But I also think, even if they didn't want to be, quote-unquote, like Ryam Redwyne, maybe they would have had it, especially in his time, a thought almost like Victarion, where he's thinking, I wish I could take that guy on, because he seems like he's so good, so I wish I could fight him. He's thinking about this with respect to, I think it's Randall Tarley. He's thinking, I wish I could fight him with Heartsbane. That would be a really good fight. So I can imagine maybe there's Ironborn of Ryam's age or afterward where they're thinking, I wish I could have fought Ryam Redwyne. That would have been a good fight. That would have been a really good fight.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. That's how the Ironborn would consider it. It's like how I would look, how I would come out against him. Not I want to be like him. I want to fight him. I like that. That's an Ironborn view of things. Don't be like them. Kill them. Even in failure, though, he sets an example. Even his time as Hand of the King comes up during the series as a way to, well, in this case, Maester Pylos giving Davos a confidence boost using evidence. Quote,
"Ser Ryam Redwyne was the greatest knight of his day, and one of the worst hands ever to serve a king. Septon Murmison's prayers worked miracles, but as hand, he soon had the whole realm praying for his death. Lord Butterwell was renowned for wit, Miles Smallwood for courage, Ser Otto Hightower for learning, yet they failed as hands, every one. As for birth, the Dragon Kings oft chose hands from amongst their own blood, with results as various as Baelor Breakspear and Maegor the Cruel. Against this, you have Septon Barth, the blacksmith's son, the old king plucked from the Red Keep's library, who gave the realm 40 years of peace and plenty." Pylos smiled. "Read your history, Lord Davos, and you will see that your doubts are groundless."
Davos currently is still Hand. Fair to say he's doing a better job, though it's a much harder job. His king is in a precarious position, nothing like Jaehaerys or Ryam Redwyne had to face, but really nothing like any Hand has had to face, if we're being fair. Maybe Davos will get to look back on this quote one day, and think about what Pylos said, and, maybe he'll think, did I do a good job? And maybe I did a better job than those guys Pylos mentioned, at least, something like that, maybe?
Well, and I wonder to what extent, if in my mind, Davos and Ryam are sort of the extremes of the guy that doesn't want the job being made Hand of the King. Davos is not out there trying to petition Stannis and say, hey, make me Hand of the King. I should be Hand.
Yeah.
In fact, again, as this quote shows, he's not trying to be Hand. He's like, I don't think that I'm capable of doing this. I don't think that this is my role. I think he's one extreme of someone who may actually be a very capable hand because he's willing to do justice in the king's name, and he's willing to tell the king, this is what you need to do in order to be a good king. I think that's one aspect. But I think what Ryam shows is the flip side of that. In other words, you're not made a good hand just because you're not ambitious. You're not made a good hand because you're neutral and you didn't want it. You can still be a bad hand and not be ambitious and be a neutral figure if you're just not good at the job. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what Ryam is.
Yeah, that's fair. Jaime was offered the job by Cersei of Hand of the King. He turned it down. He didn't explicitly think of Ryam Redwyne, but it might have been in the back of his mind. There were just obvious, more frontal reasons to decline the invitation there, or the honor, in quotes. But it would be fitting for Jaime to have that in the back of his mind, because he would have been taught about that. He would have known, that Ryam had that brief tenure's hand that didn't go well. And go ahead.
Also, I was going to add too, and again, Jaime obviously doesn't think of this, and part of this is probably because George R. Martin wasn't writing at the time, but it's possible that in Jaime's mind, the character, he's thinking, well, Ryam Redwyne was a bad hand, Criston Cole was a bad hand, Marcin Waters wasn't a particularly great hand, so I'm not really sure that there's a good precedent of making the Kingsguard or the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard Hand of the King. That's not a role that I want to take, even beyond any personal considerations.
Yet people seem to keep making that mistake, right? Like they're not learning from history.
Well, and I think it goes back to the Kingsguard should be officially neutral. So if they don't have a family that they're trying to advance, they don't have personal ambitions they're trying to advance. So of course, why shouldn't we promote them? Because they quote unquote don't want it. I don't think that is really a logic that applies. Maybe it's true, again, in the case of someone like Davos, but maybe it's not in the case like Ryam.
Barristan Selmy, in closing, is perhaps our remaining best chance to have expansion on Ryam, given they have so much in common. Barristan would know about him. He certainly would have heard the comparisons in his own life. People would compare him to Ryam, and I would love to see his own thoughts on that. If he's like, why do people make that comparison? I'm not like that. Or maybe he's like, I'm honored by that, and he would maybe have more detail. So it's an opportunity for George to expand on Ryam, just one that came to mind. I thought I'd throw that out there. It's not the only one, but it's a pretty good one.
No, I agree. And I think that, if I can have a final thought on Ryam, it's the idea that Ryam is the best and worst of what makes someone a Kingsguard. Yes, obviously he is unquestionably martially talented. He's unquestionably talented as a jouster. He may be the best there ever was, certainly among them. But he's also someone that is willing to obey a really terrible order. He's willing to turn against his sworn brother himself and also follow the king's orders on it because that's what the king ordered. And this is something that ultimately Barristan doesn't quite follow. What Barristan's arc, at least for me in A Dance with Dragons, is can you be a good Kingsguard and depose a king? Barristan eventually decides that the answer is yes, if it's an illegitimate king or someone who shouldn't be king like his star. So he comes to the conclusion on that. I don't think there's a world in which Ryam Redwyne would have ever deposed the king. I think that he's thought of himself as completely loyal to the crown, and whatever the king told him to do, that's what he was going to do, even if he himself, maybe he didn't think he would make a good hand, but the king told him to do it, so that's what he's going to do. And if the king tells him to mutilate Lucamore Strong, that's what he's going to do, and it doesn't really matter how long he's known him. So I think, I remember writing a post a really long time ago, and it was about kind of the way in which George R. Martin turns virtue into a vice with the Kingsguard. The virtue of the Kingsguard is ultimate loyalty. It's the idea that you give up everything, that you are solely devoted to the health and welfare of the king. And that should be good. That should be exactly what you want from a bodyguard. But the flip side to that is the ultimate loyalty of doing whatever the king wants. And if the king is giving you a bad order, an unjust order, a terrible order, do you still follow that? For Ryam, I think the answer was always yes.
Outro and Hot D. Ryam Redwyne did appear in House of the Dragon Season 1. He's only in Episode 1 in quite a few scenes. He's standing behind the old king, Jaehaerys, at the Great Council in that iconic shot used on magazine covers when the show was first being promoted. And he's at Emma and Balon's funeral. He's at Rhaenyra's pre-coronation ceremony. He's He escorts her to Balerian's shrine when her father is about to tell her about the Song of Ice and Fire. He steps up to Daemon when Daemon is exiled and gets all uppity and approaches the throne. He announces Alicent in an earlier scene, which I think is his only line. In episode 2, it's immediately announced that he's passed from illness. Illness could be what he died of in the books. We don't know that for sure. It's a reasonable thing to put on him because he died in his sleep. That's probably the most likely thing. The announcement comes, though, when the camera is actually focused on a glass of red wine being poured, which I thought was pretty cool.
Got him.
That was nice. I was like, hey, red wine. Look at that. It wasn't white wine. Because of the show's compressed timeline, his death is in 112 instead of 105. Whatever. Even though there wasn't much opportunity to show us Ryam's personality on the TV show, his appearance reminds us, along with the possible opportunity with Barristan, is that any character from the past, and obviously those who are still living, are subject to further discoveries, if not stories, further expansion on what we know about them, or the era they lived in, failing specifics about that particular character. And this has the potential to make us rethink any character, or many characters, entirely, or at least somewhat. Maybe Ryam had a dark side. We explored that a little bit, but there's so many other ways he could have had a dark side. Maybe he was just a jerk in private. That's not so bad, but it's possible. Maybe he prayed a lot. Maybe he was a zealot, kind of, or maybe he didn't pray much at all. Maybe he was actually as lusty as Lucamore, but never actually broke his vows. He kept it inside, which would be a big struggle. Maybe he was gay. Maybe he was a teetotaler, which would be really interesting for a person from the Arbor to not drink, It might be a way to get ahead, though. Like, well, everyone here's a drinker, and I'll be a little bit faster and quicker, stronger, and because I don't drink, Maybe. You never know, right? So these are the sort of traits that add depth and conflict to a character that if Ryam Redwyne is expanded on, these are the sort of things that someone, George or otherwise, will have to decide how to fill in those blanks. And that's a fun thing, because that's part of what we just did, was try to fill in those blanks, and it's very entertaining for us. So if someone else does it, I hope they enjoy that process, because it should be fun. And that's it. That's our episode for today. I hope you enjoyed it. We mentioned some other of our episodes that were connected to this one. We mentioned our Baelor the Blessed episodes that we did with Nina. Those are really good. There's 3 of them. We also mentioned Aemon the Dragonknight, our Jaehaerys era Fire and Blood episodes. Same goes for our Aegon the Conqueror and early Reign episodes, which Ryam would have grown up in, or just after, rather. A White Cloak Turned is Still White, a Barristan Selmy focused episode. Our Valar Rereadus chapter read-throughs or analysis on Sansa and Jon, other characters who are related to this. And of course, our Barristan Winds of Winter chapter analysis as well. Thanks so much, Nina. This was fantastic. You gave us such great insight, and I'm excited for more topics to explore with you because it always goes so well.
Oh, well, thank you. I always love doing this. I love sort of random niche topics that you can really delve into, and I think that really works with Ryam Redwyne. So I'll have to think of another one. We'll do this again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, Nina was the main writer in this episode. Probably 80-85% of it was written by her. So kudos. Clap, clap, clap.
I'm at least a 6 on the legend scale.
That's right. That's totally right.
I'm not. I'm actually not.
Well, thanks, everybody. We appreciate your support, and tell your friends if you're enjoying our episodes. Share your favorite episodes with them, and maybe you'll hook them too, and you'll be able to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire with your friends even more often, like we do. Thanks once again to Nina. On behalf of Ashea, I'm Aziz. Also, thanks to Joey Townsend for our music, Michael Klarfeld for our video intro. You can get his maps at his website. Find that in the description. And you know what to do until next time. Valar Rereadus.